Chapter 2578 The Hatred of Killing a Son. Chapter 2578 The Hatred of Killing a Son. Ling Han kept studying Neo Er's horn. After so many days, he naturally gained considerable understanding of it. The horn was formed from all the concentrated energy of the Herculean Iron Bull race. From a certain point of view, this was a celestial medicine. In fact, it was even stronger than celestial medicines. Ling Han did not use it in the concoction of alchemical pills because he was still not very familiar with the celestial medicines of this world and could not use it effectively. Hence, he made some changes and decided to just do a simple refinement of the 2 bull horns, extracting the essence that was contained inside. After returning to Tang Yuan's courtyard, he began this task, and because he feared that he would be disturbed, he entered into his spatial celestial tool. Previously, he had asked Wally to lay down formation patterns on this spatial celestial tool so that this spatial celestial tool would be very hard to find, and even if it was found, the formation patterns would activate and would offer a considerable defense. No matter what, this was also a celestial tool. It was only that it could not be used to attack, but concentrating all its power on defense, it naturally was very impressive. However, Ling Han was only a 3rd heaven celestial king after all. Hence, Luo Fuming only had to search seriously, and he still managed to find this spatial celestial tool very quickly. Ling Han imposed time acceleration effects on himself. Not even half a day had passed in real time, and he had already refined both bull horns, turning them into a bowl of golden liquid. At present, he already possessed that indestructible cauldron. Whether it was for alchemy or extracting the essence of ingredients, it was extremely useful. A portion for each of us. Ling Han poured out half a small bowlful of golden liquid for the Empress, and there was still less than half for bewitching Maiden Ro. This liquid was very nutritious. Seals of great Tao wafted from the bowl, manifesting into various beings of this heaven and earth. However, this thing was something that no one that was not a celestial king could make us of, so there was for Lu Yutong and the others. Little Terror also had its own share. The 3 people and 1 beast shared it equally among themselves. Can this be consumed? Bewitching Maiden Ro asked, frowning. She had witnessed personally how this liquid was formed from melting bull horns. Ling Han stretched out a hand. Give it back to me if you don't want it. Who said I didn't want it? Bewitching Maiden Ro hurriedly picked up the bowl and rolled her eyes at Ling Han. This guy was really irritating. She was just acting coy, so why was he so insensitive? The Empress smiled and drained the golden liquid first. Sponsored by Liberty Mutual C, more E-Trade A. To readers, our content is stolen. Please copy and search this link. Me to support us. When Little Terror saw how its mistress had already drunk it, it stuck out its tongue to lap at it. Ling Han also drained it in a single gulp. Meanwhile, bewitching Maiden Ro, looking like a little wife that had been bullied, sipped it slowly. After consumption, the 3 people and 1 beast immediately began to digest the medicinal effects. The power contained in the bull horns was astonishingly frightening. Neo Er was a 4th heaven monarch tier, and Yoda was a 5th heaven monarch star. Close to 90% of their energy had been extracted, and even if it was divided into 4 equal shares, it was still comparable to celestial medicines. Initially, Ling Han had wanted to continue improving his physique, but though the bull horns were very nutritious, they could not compare to the United Origin manifestation fruit, and could only be used to improve his cultivation level. Hence, Ling Han had no other choice. His cultivation level began to spike. Sponsored by Verizon Seymour. When one had reached the level of Celestial King tier, they would take millions of years to breach the gap to the successive minor cultivation levels, even when consuming the highest tier of celestial medicines daily. Furthermore, after one had reached 7th heaven and 8th heaven celestial king tier, there are basically only a few types of great herbs that could still be effective. Hence, The spiking of Ling Han's cultivation level was also corresponding to this. Compared to the advancement of other celestial kings, he could be considered to have extreme speed. But if the third heaven was divided into 10 steps, this was only enough to help him take 1 step forwards. However, Ling Han had been close to the peak stage of the third heaven already. After taking this 1 step, he had truly come in contact with the ceiling of the third heaven. It should be known that his evolution index had already reached 12. In fact, it was possible that it had even surpassed it by a slight sliver. His final achievement had to be a first-tier heavenly venerate, at the very least. So would there be any bottleneck in his breakthrough to the fourth heaven? Under the time acceleration effects, in just 11 days, he had already broken through the barrier to the fourth heaven. The heavenly tribulation instantly formed. Ling Han naturally would not be undergoing the tribulation inside the spatial celestial tool. Otherwise, being barraged by the heavenly tribulation, even divine metal could possibly be destroyed. Hence, Ling Han stepped out of the celestial tool. Ling Han immediately discovered that there were 2 people standing presently in front of him. One was Tang Yuan, and the other was a middle-aged man who had 7 streaks of peculiar light wrapped around him. Ling Han only had to think for a while, and immediately realized that this was Luo Yang's old man, and he had come to seek him out for revenge. Come on then. Damn brat! Luo Fuming's eyes became vicious, and were filled with boundless greed. That was because he saw that Ling Han had flown out from that divine metal, and had also stowed the divine metal away while he was at it. He immediately distinguished that this was a spatial celestial tool, and this caused his heart to beat even harder in excitement. To be so exorbitant to actually use divine metal to forge a spatial celestial tool. Just how wealthy did this guy have to be? At the beginning, the Celestial King Graveyard had indeed imprisoned celestial kings that had powerful backgrounds and could not be killed without much inconvenience. And that was why they had been thrown there, so that they could kill each other. However, as time passed, a considerable number of celestial kings without much background had also been thrown in here. Because compared to directly killing them, tossing them into the Celestial King Graveyard was the best form of torture. Sponsored by Liberty Mutual Seymour. No matter what, this was still a prison. Furthermore, it was filled with bloodshed. It was possible that they would not live to see tomorrow, which placed them under a mountain of pressure. Luo Fuming was the latter type. He did not have much of a background. On the contrary, he had offended a person who had a powerful background, and that was why he had been thrown into the Celestial King Graveyard. He was certain that there had to be a heavenly venerate standing behind Ling Han. Otherwise, how could the latter have such exorbitance to use divine metal just to forge a spatial celestial tool? Die. Luo Fuming moved, wanting to kill Ling Han in a single stroke. He did not care what kind of background Ling Han had. Everyone's life was worthless once they were in here. Ling Han broke into a grin. Are you sure about that? Boom! It was as if the heaven and earth was replying as a bolt of lightning descended down on him. Luo Fuming forcefully withdrew his offensive. This guy was actually about to undergo a tribulation. He did not dare interfere. The higher the cultivation level, the more terrifying the heavenly tribulation would be. Because this was close to the limits of the heavenly tribulation, the fiercer the heaven and earth would target you. No one would be able to easily reach these limits. Why was a 7th heaven celestial king like him unable to advance to the 8th heaven? On the one hand, it was indeed because great Tao was hard to grasp, and on the other hand, he feared heavenly tribulation. It was possible that the day he succeeded would also be the day of his death. Fuck! Why had it been so coincidental that he just happened to encounter the tribulation that Ling Han was facing? Tang Yuan was also startled. Ling Han was going to undergo a tribulation. Then wouldn't that mean he was going to become a 4th heaven celestial king? Hiss! This guy had not gotten the ascending dragon pill yet, but was already so easily surging into the 4th heaven. Tang Yuan was practically dying of jealousy. Who knew how many ascending dragon pills he had ingested? But he was still stuck in the second heaven even now. If these ascending dragon pills had been used on another second heaven celestial king, that guy would probably have reached the fourth heaven or fifth heaven by now. His aptitude was indeed not very good. In fact, it could be considered very poor. It was all thanks to the fact that he had a very good father, or there would have been absolutely no way he could have become a celestial king. With this comparison, he was naturally extremely jealous. Ling Han merely smiled. Would these two people dare to interfere with his heavenly tribulation? He surged into the skies, meeting the great celestial King Tyr tribulation. Boom! An extremely terrifying bolt of lightning struck. Ling Han endured it, and was immediately sent flying out of the city. He temporarily had no wish to turn hostile with a ninth heaven celestial king. Thus, he did not undergo the tribulation inside the city. Otherwise, probably even the whole Ghost King city would be destroyed under the effects of this kind of great tribulation. Boom! 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 Lightning struck endlessly, chasing after him every step of the way. The heaven and earth was targeting him, and no matter where he fled, it would be useless. Xiao, Luo fuming, also followed closely behind, to say nothing that he bore a hatred against Ling Han for killing his son. Even if it was just for that spatial celestial tool that belonged to Ling Han, there was no way he could let Ling Han escape. Chapter 2579 Fourth Heaven Celestial King. Chapter 2579 Fourth Heaven Celestial King. Ling Han faced off against heavenly tribulation. At the same time, his divine sense also underwent a dramatic change. His celestial seed was undergoing a fourth transformation. Heavenly tribulation boomed, its might astounding. Such was its sheer ferocity that even with Ling Han's physique, he still became riddled with wounds. The might of this heavenly tribulation had definitely reached the seventh heaven. Otherwise, it couldn't have wounded Ling Han. However, the more powerful this tribulation was, the more delighted Ling Han would be. After all, as long as he could endure it without dying, his cultivation would definitely rise at a rapid rate. Heavenly tribulation provided the purest of energy. This was the most suitable nutrient for his celestial seed. Inside his mind, the celestial tree had already sprouted. In this fourth transformation, it was growing from a bud into a sapling. Nearby, Luo fuming wore a deep frown. Ling Han was only advancing to the fourth heaven, so why did the might of his tribulation rival that of his when he had advanced to the seventh heaven? Just what kind of freak was he? He could already rival the seventh heaven while at the fourth heaven. Most importantly, Ling Han still hadn't died. Back then, Luo fuming hadn't done much better. He had been fortunate enough to endure the tribulation, yet he had been left with a great number of wounds. He had only been a hair away from death's door. This was inconceivable, unfathomable. This young man was an absolute freak. However, enduring the tribulation would definitely exhaust his vitality. Moreover, Luo fuming was already at the peak stage of the seventh heaven, so trying to suppress someone who was equivalent in power to him at the early stage of the seventh heaven would naturally be a simple task, especially since this person was also severely wounded. Moreover, the more freakish Ling Han was, the more treasures he would naturally possess. Luo fuming could barely conceal his greed. Because of this opportunity, perhaps he would be able to rapidly soar into the sky. Tang Mingbo and the Azure Ghost Celestial King, they would only be worthy to prostrate before him. Boom! Heavenly tribulation continued its wanton punishment of Ling Han. The closer his cultivation edged to the limit of heaven and earth, the more violent the reaction from heaven and earth. Heaven and earth did all in its power to prevent him from reaching a new height. However, Ling Han was brimming with confidence. In his mind, the celestial seed was steadily growing, already producing 2 healthy leaves. This was delightful progress. He hoped to take a step forward after overcoming heavenly tribulation. Even though this was only a single step, if he treated it like normal, it would require him hundreds of millions or even tens of billions of years to complete. Time flew by, and Luo Fuming sat cross-legged and waiting. He was resting and adjusting himself to his peak condition. He desired to slay Ling Han with his peak battle prowess. Otherwise, he was afraid that someone with a powerful background such as Ling Han might possess some devastating trump cards. One day quickly passed by. Heavenly tribulation also drew to an end. Following the last bolt of lightning, the dark clouds in the sky dissipated as if they had never existed in the first place. Boom! A terrifying attack surged over, shattering the surrounding space and drowning the void with arcs of lightning, and transforming it into a sea of crackling energy. Heavenly tribulation again. No, this was the doing of Luo Fuming. He had surprisingly cultivated the great Tao of lightning, so the attacks that he unleashed were much like a return of heavenly tribulation. Ling Han roared and replied with a punch. Pum! He was instantly sent flying back. However, Luo Fuming also shuddered, surprisingly unable to charge forward and press his advantage. A smile tugged at the corners of Ling Han's lips. With a single exchange, he had already gained a deep understanding of his opponent's battle prowess. He had just advanced to the fourth heaven, yet his vitality index had already soared to over 10,000. Meanwhile, even though Luo Fuming was a seventh heaven celestial king, his talent wasn't great, so he was only an emperor tier at most. It was thanks to the fact that he was already at the peak stage of the seventh heaven that his vitality index had reached over 11,000. In the outside world, it was simply impossible for emperor tiers to become seventh heaven celestial kings. Here, however, the existence of the ascending dragon pill transformed the impossible into possible. There was a gulf between them in terms of battle prowess, though this didn't lead to a one-sided battle. With a shake, Ling Han channeled the indestructible heaven scroll. His wounds from the tribulation healed at a rapid speed. Heavenly tribulation was fairly good in this sense. It was terrifying when it attacked, but as long as one could overcome it, they wouldn't suffer any Tao injuries. Luo Fuming was transfixed with shock upon seeing this. Ling Han's battle prowess had already been astonishingly powerful, yet his recovery ability was also this freakish. Was he truly human? He gritted his teeth. Regardless of whether it was to avenge his son or for his own greed, he definitely couldn't give up now. Die! He unleashed attack after attack. No matter what, he still possessed an absolute advantage in terms of battle prowess. If it really came to it, he would simply expend some more energy to conclude the battle. After all, could a seventh heaven celestial king not dispose of a newly advanced fourth heaven celestial king? At this moment, Tang Yuan also arrived. He had gotten lost just then, but the violent attacks of heavenly tribulation had pointed him back in the right direction again. Not only he, but his underlings were also present. However, there were only 7 remaining. Their jaws fell to the ground in unison when they saw Ling Han battling against Luo Fuming. In fact, their mouths opened and closed as if they were fish out of water. This was simply inconceivable. A fourth heaven celestial king could be this freakishly powerful. However, regardless of how powerful Ling Han was, it was only a matter of time before he was killed. Tang Yuan and the others all shook their heads. It was clear that Ling Han's battle prowess was inferior. However, he still insisted on facing Luo Fuming head-on. If he wasn't killed, would there still be reason in this world? Celestial kings were indeed difficult to kill, and this was because they could flee quickly. However, with celestial kings like Ling Han, who only battled head-on with no regard for anything else, it would be rather strange if they didn't wound up dead. Die, die, die! Luo Fuming roared as he wielded a sea of celestial lightning. He yearned to immediately blast Ling Han into ashes. However, Ling Han's defenses were rock solid, even though he suffered more and more wounds. And even though these wounds also became increasingly severe, he still continued to battle. At the same time, his counterattacks also remained precise and deadly. Ling Han was pushing himself. He still had trump cards such as the Divine Demon Sword, and he could still elevate his body art once he uncapped the limit on his cultivation. However, he didn't rely on any of these things. Instead, he continued to exchange blows with Luo Fuming using the power of regulations. He wanted to stabilize his cultivation and raise his potential. However, this resulted in his wounds becoming increasingly severe. He flirted with death time and time again. Yet it was during these moments of peril that he also attained endless enlightenment. He was confident that this battle would greatly aid the growth of his battle prowess. The problems brought about by his rapid rise in cultivation level would most likely be resolved. It was very likely that he wouldn't be at risk of having a mental state that couldn't keep up with his cultivation level. Cease your futile struggle. I'll grant you a swift death. Luo Fuming roared with a humph. He was astonished and alarmed by Ling Han's stubbornness. Once this young person took another step forward, he would definitely become powerful enough to rival him. Ling Han's wounds were severe. One of his arms had already been broken, and there was also a gaping wound in his abdomen, almost piercing through his entire body. His left foot was crippled, and his right foot had more so disappeared. At this moment, he was completely drenched in blood. He panted like an old bull, and his flame of life flickered as if it were about to be extinguished at any moment. Even though his recovery ability was astonishing, his opponent's attacks were even more powerful. He was slowly but surely being dragged to the abyss of death. He was done for. At this moment, he was truly done for. Tang Yuan watched on, unsure of what to feel. On the one hand, he wanted to kill Ling Han, this traitorous subject who dared to threaten him. On the other hand, he also wanted to rely on Ling Han to help him seek revenge and gather wealth. As such, he was filled with conflicting emotions. However, things were much simpler for the others. They resented Ling Han for snatching away Tang Yuan's favor, so they naturally wanted Ling Han to die. Die. Luo Fuming said with a sneer. He summoned a blade of lightning, thrusting forth and yearning to penetrate Ling Han's chest with a single strike. Under the ferocious power of lightning, Ling Han's vitality would be instantly extinguished. However, a smile spread across Ling Han's face as he finally unsheathed his divine demon sword. He couldn't play around any longer. Otherwise, this would no longer be a process of tempering himself. It would be an act of seeking death. Chapter 2580. Forced to retreat. Chapter 2580. Forced to retreat. Upon appearing, the divine demon's sword instantly reawakened. This was a celestial tool, personally refined by Ling Han, so he could naturally unleash all of its might with a single thought. The divine demon's sword alone naturally couldn't rival a seventh heaven celestial king. However, the cooperation between Ling Han and the divine demon sword was a completely different matter. At this moment, the sharpness and destructive ability of the celestial tool could be fully unleashed. It was simply devastating. With sword in hand, Ling Han was like a completely different person. He launched an aggressive counterattack. Meanwhile, Luo Fuming shrouded himself in regulations, desiring to face the attacks of the divine demon sword head-on. However, he was only a seventh heaven celestial king and an emperor tier, and the divine demon sword was no ordinary celestial tool. This was a sword that had engulfed an exorbitant amount of divine metal, which allowed its destructive ability to increase significantly. With these two factors combined, how could Luo Fuming possibly rival the divine demon sword head-on? He was instantly cut several times, which left him wounded and bleeding. Fortunately, his advantage in cultivation level meant that he wasn't instantly killed, like Nyoda. Apprehension crept into his mind. He no longer dared to engage in close-quarters combat with Ling Han, and he instead launched a barrage of attacks from a distance. However, this naturally resulted in his attacks becoming weaker. With such power, could he possibly kill Ling Han? this would be a very difficult task. This was the importance of celestial tools. They could directly affect the outcome of a battle. However, even though Ling Han had summoned the divine demon sword, he wasn't counting on it to achieve victory. After all, Luo Fuming's advantage in cultivation level was far too great. This gifted him a significant advantage. Unless Ling Han could trick and kill him with a single slash as he had done with Nyoda, it would be near impossible to kill him. Was his opponent a fool who would battle to the death? Ling Han held a dimension scroll in his left hand and started to extract its energy. Heaven and earth remained tranquil, with no sign of dark clouds or rolling thunder. Ling Han silently nodded in his mind, as expected of a transcendent dimension. Its tolerance was extremely powerful, and it didn't target him at all. If this were the celestial realm, he wouldn't dare to refine the dimension scroll in such a flagrant manner. Just extracting a tad too much energy from the dimension scroll would attract a heavenly venerate tribulation. He greedily absorbed the power of the dimension scroll. This power coursed through his body, bringing joy to his each and every cell. At the same time, his power also started to rise at an astonishing rate. Ling Han calmly breathed. White mist was exhaled from his nose, transforming into a white dragon that danced back and forth. His heartbeat also grew stronger and louder, and it was as if there were a deep and powerful rumble of thunder. This was his physique becoming more powerful. Luo Fuming was stunned. He could sense Ling Han's astonishing vitality. His flame of life was as brilliant as the sun. Was this truly a celestial king? Could celestial kings reach such a terrifying level? Just what in the world was this brat holding? It was only after retrieving this matter that his flame of life became so brilliant and his heartbeat became so thunderous. In fact, this even affected Luo Fuming, causing the rhythm of his heartbeat to also sync with Ling Han's. Hand that over. Luo Fuming roared. He unleashed a movement technique, aiming to evade the divine demon sword's deadly attacks and snatch the dimension scroll. However, would Ling Han let him succeed? With a turn of his body, he easily dodged Luo Fuming's strike. He then launched a powerful counterattack, unleashing wave after wave of blinding sword chi with his divine demon sword. He needed time. The further one progressed in the celestial king tier, the greater the gulf between each heaven. Thus, if he wanted to elevate his body art to the fourth heaven, he would need to extract from the dimension scroll an amount of energy equivalent to the total of what he had extracted for the first to third heaven. He needed at least 10 days. However, Ling Han was in no rush. In his battle with Luo Fuming, he had been able to survive even without his divine demon sword. Thus, he had nothing to worry about now that he had the divine demon sword in hand. Moreover, the longer the time that passed, the more powerful he would become. The battle was slowly shifting in his favor. Luo Fuming was still battling hard, holding on to the hope that he could eventually suppress and kill Ling Han. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Time flew by. Ling Han's strength also continued to grow. His body art had already caught up to, and even surpassed his power of regulations. Unlike the power of regulations, which increased in a linear manner, his body art could rise exponentially as long as he unlocked his cultivation limit. Combining his body art with the power of regulations, and adding to that his divine demon sword, he now possessed the power to genuinely rival Luo Fuming. Of course, it was also due to Luo Fuming's condition. Firstly, Luo Fuming didn't possess a celestial tool. Secondly, Luo Fuming's talent was also far too inferior. In fact, it would have been impossible for him to reach the 7th heaven in the outside world. At most, he could have only reached the 1st heaven or 2nd heaven. Ah! Luo Fuming bellowed in rage as he furiously turned around. Whoosh! He transformed into a puff of smoke as he instantly dashed into the distance. He lost confidence in his ability to win the battle. His opponent was growing stronger by the minute, and he was even showing signs of surpassing him. Ling Han didn't give chase. His opponent was intent on leaving, and his cultivation level was also far superior to his. Thus, how could Ling Han obstruct him? In any case, it was only a matter of time before he would stir great trouble in Ghost King City. At that time, he would settle all of these matters. Gazing at the sword-wielding Ling Han, a cold chill shot down Tang Yuan's spine. This youth was far too terrifying. He had only just advanced to the 4th heaven, yet he could already rival a 7th heaven celestial king. In fact, he had even forced his opponent to retreat. Following this logic, when Ling Han reached the 6th heaven, wouldn't he be able to rival paramount 9th heaven celestial kings? Tang Yuan's greatest basis for confidence was his father. However, if Ling Han could rival his father, would he still have any confidence when facing Ling Han? Even though this day was still very far away, Tang Yuan had a feeling that it would inevitably arrive. Even he felt this, so it was only natural that the others did as well. Their eyes were all filled with apprehension and terror as they gazed at Ling Han. They could only act in such a wanton manner because of their fathers. However, what stood before them now was a person who could one day rival their fathers. How could this not terrify them? There were no rules in the Celestial King graveyard. There was only slaughter and death. Before Ling Han, they felt not even an iota of safety. Ling Han sheathed his sword. He turned to Tang Yuan and said, "Ascending dragon pill." Tang Yuan shuddered upon hearing this. However, upon seeing displeasure appear on Ling Han's face, he hurriedly retrieved a vial and respectfully offered it to Ling Han. Right now, he was truly afraid of Ling Han. This was because Ling Han could genuinely threaten his life. In fact, Ling Han could even leave with leisure after killing him. Tang Yuan loved to abuse his power, and he loved to act with haughtiness and ruthlessness. However, compared to his life, he was willing to abandon all of these things. Ling Han accepted the vial, patting Tang Yuan's shoulder lightly and saying, "If you need me for a battle, then come and call me. I promised that I would battle for you, and I'm a man of my word." Tang Yuan surprisingly felt overwhelmed by flattery as he hurriedly nodded his head. Ling Han walked off with a swagger. He needed to cultivate in seclusion, not only to stabilize his cultivation, but also to digest his experiences from the battle with Luo Fuming. Even though he accelerated time, this period of seclusion still lasted for 3 months. During this time, the Empress and Bewitching Maiden Ro both advanced. However, because Ling Han still hadn't returned yet, their breakthroughs naturally didn't attract much attention. Ling Han appraised his own power. If he unleashed his full battle prowess, he could now rival 7th heaven celestial kings. Of course, this was referring to 7th heaven celestial kings like Luo Fuming, who had relied on ascending dragon pills to reach this level. If his opponent were a genuine monarch tier or monarch star, however, Ling Han would still be able to defend himself. He returned to Tang Yuan's residence. However, he had just barely settled down when Tang Yuan came over to visit. "You finally returned. Can I challenge Luli now?" Tang Yuan asked in eagerness. Seeking revenge on Lu Li had always been his obsession. It was also because of this that he had been impatiently awaiting Ling Han's return. Thus, even if he wanted to target Ling Han, that would have to wait until after he exacted revenge on Lu Li. Ling Han naturally didn't mind this. After all, his goal for coming here was to battle and temper himself. He nodded and replied, "Sure." "Then I'll organize it straight away," Tang Yuan said. He didn't dare to linger around for too long. He was terrified of Ling Han from the bottom of his heart. Ling Han waved his hand in dismissal. He had been digesting his experiences from the battle these past few days, and right now he finally had time to take out the ascending dragon pill. He planned to examine it carefully. This was a pill that could allow Emperor tiers and even King tiers to advance to the Celestial King tier. Moreover, their progress wouldn't stop at the 1st heaven. This intrigued him immensely. Chapter 2581 Tamed. Chapter 2581 Tamed. Ling Han scraped off a tiny bit of the ascending dragon pill before examining it with his divine sense. However, it was naturally difficult to determine what ingredients had been used and what refinement processes had been employed. He placed it inside his mouth and tasted it, and this instantly caused enlightenment to flash across his eyes. It was as if the great Tao were before him within touching distance. It was no wonder that this pill could increase the chance of advancing through the Celestial King tier. Its effects were truly heaven-defying. He called Tang Yuan over and started to ask him about the ascending dragon pill. "Where did you get it from?" Tang Yuan's reply was extremely simple. "My father gave it to me." As for where Tang Mingbo had obtained it from, the Azure Ghost Celestial King, Ling Han stroked his chin. If he wanted to obtain the pill recipe of the ascending dragon pill, perhaps he had to seek out the Azure Ghost Celestial King. The person who had invented the ascending dragon pill was definitely a genius among geniuses. According to Tang Yuan, every single city in the Celestial King graveyard had ascending dragon pills. Even though they were astoundingly dear, they were certainly not hard to find. Strange. This kind of precious alchemical pill should be extremely few in number. However, it was a shame that Wally wasn't present. Otherwise, Ling Han could get him to analyze the pill. In terms of this, Wally was countless times more capable than him, a grand alchemist. If he had a chance, he would need to take a look around the mansion of the Azure Ghost Celestial King. In fact, it was most likely no secret that he had forced Luo, fuming, to retreat. Thus, it was possible that the Azure Ghost Celestial King was already aware of his existence and had intentions of recruiting him. However, why hadn't he seen the Azure Ghost Celestial King yet? Perhaps he was busy with other matters, so he had no time to deal with Ling Han right now. It wasn't long before Li gave a reply, accepting Tang Yuan's challenge. Tang Yuan was ecstatic upon hearing this. He had waited for so long, and it was finally time for him to exact revenge. They agreed to hold the battle in 3 days' time. This would be a battle between blood martial kings, so it was only natural that it would gather a lot of attention. When the tournament ground released news of this, it instantly sent countless people into a frenzy. If someone were to conduct a survey, they would quickly discover that there was one-sided support for Shi Yuan, Lu Li's blood martial king. Why was this? This was because Ling Han's taunting behavior had been far too detestable, causing his popularity to plummet. In fact, everyone in Ghost King City wanted to see him killed. However, in another sense, this was also a sign of his draw power. Otherwise, would there be so many people paying attention to him? Being infamous was also a sign of fame. The day finally arrived, and with it, a flood of spectators. The tickets to enter were pushed to an astonishing price, yet they were still extremely difficult to get a hold of. Ling Han was called out after waiting in the resting area for a while. After becoming a blood martial king, he was afforded much better treatment. Meanwhile, his opponent also appeared at the same time. Shi Yuan, blood martial king, who had already achieved 9 victories. Taking into account the fact that victories would be deducted after a loss, his achievement was truly something to be proud of. However, even Niu Da and Niu Er had been slain by Ling Han, so it would truly be a miracle if Shi Yuan, a third heaven celestial king, could achieve victory against Ling Han. The commentator was introducing them at the moment, and the spectators were all fervently cheering for Shi Yuan. Meanwhile, Ling Han felt bored out of his mind. This person had a lower cultivation level than him. So how could he excite Ling Han's fighting spirit? In the stands, however, Tang Yuan couldn't feel more different. He was filled with excitement. In fact, he would be delighted even if Ling Han were only pummeling a mountain river tier weakling. After all, this signified his victory over Lu Li. And that a Yuan. He furiously clutched the arms of his chair. He would have that person dead. However, it was a slight blemish that Lu Li hadn't come even though he had accepted the challenge. Perhaps he had foreseen a loss, so he had decided against coming lest he was humiliated before everyone. A sneer tugged at Tang Yuan's lips as this thought flashed across his mind. The battle began, and sure enough, Shi Yuan was convincingly killed by Ling Han in just a few exchanges. Do you feel extremely ecstatic? Perhaps you want to rub this in my face? Lu Li's voice suddenly sounded behind him. Tang Yuan faltered for a moment before feeling immense delight. He had never imagined that he would one day feel happy hearing the voice of Lu Li. Ha! He had won this battle, so wouldn't it be a shame if there was no one for him to humiliate? He immediately turned around and was just about to speak. However, shock quickly spread across his face. This was because he saw not only Lu Li but also Yang Shaoling. This was a poisonous spider who could rank in the top 3 among all of the second-generation young masters. Right now, however, she was like an obedient wife as she accompanied Lu Li. Moreover, one of Lu Li's hands was beneath her dress, wantonly playing with her breasts. Tang Yuan understood that Yang Shaoling was a bold and unrestrained person who had astonishingly unconstrained sexual relationships. However, it was only ever she who toyed with other men. Thus, how is it possible that she was being toyed with by Lu Li at this moment? In terms of strength, Yang Shaoling was a 4th heaven celestial king, far more powerful than Lu Li. In terms of background, Celestial King Yang Ke was also far more powerful than Lu Gaoquan. There was a ranking among the 9th heaven celestial kings, with the Azure Ghost Celestial King being first, and Yang Ke and Dongfang Pa being 2nd and 3rd, respectively. The gulf between them wasn't great. Meanwhile, Lu Gaoquan was only ranked around 10th, not too different from Tang Yuan's own father. Thus, what right did Lu Li have to wantonly toy with Yang Shaoling? It was precisely this confusion that caused a cold chill to run down Tang Yuan's spine. Lu Li sat down, and Yang Shaoling kneeled down next to him, giving him a massage. She was as obedient as a maidservant. Tang Yuan, are you shocked? He asked with a smile. In fact, it wasn't only Tang Yuan who was astonished. Even Zhao Shuang was rendered completely speechless. The scene before them was incomprehensible and almost impossible to believe. I always live up to my words, Lu Li said smugly. Before, he had said that Yang Shaoling would enter his bed. By the looks of things now, this had become a reality. Yang Shaoling was like a prostitute as she followed him, and did she still have a sliver of dignity left? Tang Yuan and Zhao Shuang were both speechless with shock. They would need to spend several days to digest this. Tang Yuan, your level is far too low, so I can't be bothered playing around with you anymore, Lu Li said in disdain. However, since you insist on playing, I'll satisfy your desire. I'll give you a chance. Kneel. Tang Yuan immediately humphed upon hearing this. Was this a joke? Even though he didn't know why Yang Shaoling was as obedient as a dog, Yang Shaoling was Yang Shaoling, and he was himself. How could he yield to Lu Li? To say nothing of Lu Li, he wouldn't even yield to the Yin River Celestial King. In your dreams, Lu Li. Lu Li roared with laughter, saying, Why don't we make a bet? Tonight, you'll definitely come to my residence, and you'll kneel down to me like a dog. Oh, that's right. Don't forget to bring your own dog when you come. I'm quite interested in him. I said you're dreaming. Wake up, will you? Tang Yuan said coldly. See you tomorrow. Lu Li stood up and left. Yang Shaoling obediently followed him, and it was as if she had replaced a Yuan. However, there was fury and humiliation hidden in her eyes. After a while, Tang Yuan looked at Zhao Shuang and said, Did that really just happen? It wasn't someone disguised as Sister Ling, right? Zhao Shuang asked. He couldn't accept this either. Tang Yuan shook his head and said, Wearing a disguise is easy. However, where would one find a female 4th heaven celestial king? Moreover, who dares to impersonate Sister Ling? What in the world happened with Lu Li? How did he obtain such astonishing power? Zhao Shuang sucked in a sharp breath. His hands and feet felt ice cold, and he paused for a moment before asking, "Will you go?" Tang Yuan humphed and replied, "Even if that was truly Sister Ling, she's Yang Shaoling and I'm Tang Yuan. He wants me to yield? Pay, that's impossible. He wants me to become his dog? I'd rather die." However, Zhao Shuang didn't dare to agree blindly. Just what kind of temperament does Sister Ling have? Yet, she was still completely tamed by Lu Li. "Tang Yuan, don't be so sure of yourself." Tang Yuan didn't reply. He had his own pride and dignity. What did it matter even if Lu Li became a ninth heaven celestial king? His father was also a ninth heaven celestial king, so what did he need to be afraid of? Chapter 2582, Comprehensive Loss. Chapter 2582, Comprehensive Loss. They all returned. Ling Han was still investigating the ascending dragon pill. This was a local specialty, and he had never seen it anywhere else before. This caused him to speculate in his mind. Perhaps the ascending dragon pill used some kind of ingredient that only existed in this place. In that case, if he took some ascending dragon pills with him when he left, just how great a fortune would he make? To raise the cultivation of celestial kings was a power that only heavenly venerates could possess. However, the ascending dragon pills could increase the chance of advancing to the next level by 10%. This was simply incredible. Theoretically speaking, as long as one took enough ascending dragon pills, they would definitely succeed in breaking through if they made 10 attempts. Just the thought of this was terrifying. While Ling Han was lost in thought about this, Tang Yuan received a letter from his father. A celestial king appeared with 5 ribbons of iridescent light around him. He clasped his hands in respect when he saw Tang Yuan, saying, "My respects to young master." Tang Yuan didn't think much of fifth heaven celestial kings, and he casually raised his hand before asking, "What's the matter?" "The Lord has a command for young master," the celestial king replied as he retrieved a letter. There was a unique symbol on this letter, and it would shatter and disappear once the letter was opened. Thus, one could easily determine whether their letter had been tampered with. Tang Yuan accepted the letter, though he didn't open it on the spot. He simply waved his hand and said, "All right, understood. You can leave now." However, the celestial king remained unmoving, saying, "The Lord commanded you to immediately open the letter." Tang Yuan faltered upon hearing this, and displeasure instantly spread across his face. This person actually dared to hurry him up. He was just about to unleash his anger. However, after some thought, he decided to endure this. Since his father had given such an order, this was definitely an important matter. He opened the letter. However, as he read over it, his face instantly became beet red, and it was as if flames were about to explode from his eyes. "Bastard!" He immediately slammed his hand on the table and stood up, pointing at the celestial king and roaring, "You actually dared to forge a letter from my father to humiliate me!" "How would I dare? This is indeed a command from the Lord," the celestial king said in a solemn voice. He remained upright and dignified. Tang Yuan surprisingly calmed down as he read the letter again. This was indeed his father's writing. Moreover, the seal had also been unique to his father, and there had been no sign of any tampering. However, he genuinely didn't dare to believe this. This was because his father had surprisingly told him to immediately visit Lu Li and apologize to him. If he couldn't satisfy Lu Li, there would be no need for him to return. He would disown his son. Tang Yuan's hands were shaking. There was also an extra request in the letter, telling him to wear a dress when he walked over. This was far too terrifying. He had said before that instead of yielding to Lu Li, he would rather wear a floral dress and run around on the streets. Now, however, Tang Mingbo was commanding him to do exactly this. Lu Li's power had far exceeded his expectations. He had only dared to oppose Lu Li because his father was a ninth heaven celestial king. Now, however, even Tang Mingbo was refusing to support him, and instead choosing to support Lu Li. This instantly caused him to feel empty inside. Amid his boundless fury and vexation, he also felt an intense sense of apprehension. It was no wonder that young Shaoling had become like that. Even their fathers were heaping pressure on them, so what could they do? He powerlessly sat down. After a long while, he finally said, "I understand. I'll take my leave now," the Celestial King said as he turned around to leave. Tang Yuan remained silent for a long time. A bitter smile appeared on his face. His father had already issued such a command, so did he dare to disobey? He had initially thought that he had finally won a battle against Lu Li. In the end, however, he had actually suffered a resounding loss. Even his father stood behind Lu Li. He recalled Lu Li's words at this moment, telling him to also bring Ling Han over. At this moment, a cold smile slowly spread across his face. Ling Han was a wanton and fearless person. If he locked horns with Lu Li, he. Anyhow, that would have nothing to do with Tang Yuan. The latter would immediately make that clear. He immediately stood up, walking over to find Ling Han. "Li Long, something important has come up. Follow me too. Please come with me." He was filled with anger, so his words were inevitably forceful as well. However, he immediately corrected himself. Ling Han glanced at him and asked, "What matter?" "Fuck me dead. What the fuck are you asking for? If I tell you to come, then fucking come with me? Where the fuck are you getting all this nonsense from? Is this the proper attitude for an underling?" However, he immediately controlled himself. This was not the time to turn against Ling Han. Right now, the most important thing was to trick Ling Han into meeting Lu Li. He hurriedly said, "I need to attend a feast and have another battle with Lu Li, so I need your help." Ling Han nodded and replied, "All right." They immediately set off. However, immediately after leaving, Tang Yuan tore away his outer layer of clothes, revealing a floral dress. Even as someone who didn't fear heaven or earth, Ling Han couldn't help but grimace upon seeing this. What's going on? Has something gone wrong with his brain? Or has he been possessed? However, if Ling Han had witnessed the battle between Tang Yuan and Lu Li from beginning to end, he would have immediately guessed that Tang Yuan had suffered a comprehensive loss. However, he hadn't been present, so he merely found this very strange. Tang Yuan's face was also burning with embarrassment. However, he forced a smile and said, "The main theme of this feast is cross-dressing." However, upon seeing Ling Han's face darken, he hurriedly said, you don't need to. The two of them walked across the city, and it was inevitable that they would pass many people. All of them wore strange expressions as they looked at Tang Yuan, and even Ling Han was the subject of many sideways glances. These were two freaks. However, most people recognized Tang Yuan, and they didn't dare to offend this young master. After all, who would want to invite death? They all ran away after stealing a single glance at him. This kind of depraved and freakish young master had nothing to do with them. After walking for an hour, they arrived at Lu Li's residence. There were two guards at the gate, and they both burst into laughter when they saw Tang Yuan. This was the young master of the Tang clan. Right now, however, he was actually wearing a floral dress. He had truly lost all face. Others were afraid of Tang Yuan, but they weren't afraid at all. This was because their master was Lu Li. Ling Han frowned when he saw this. If the main theme of the feast was cross-dressing, would these two guards dare to laugh at Tang Yuan? Even if they were audacious and naive, they still wouldn't dare to do so. Something was not right. He immediately roared, "Impudence! You actually dare to laugh at young Master Tang." One of the guards immediately humphed and said, "Young Master Tang? Before our young master, he's nothing but trash. He's coming to apologize. Yet you still dare to act with such arrogance? Are you seeking death?" Ling Han immediately came to a realization. As it turned out, Tang Yuan had come here to surrender. It was no wonder that he was wearing a floral dress. TSK. He was truly showing utmost sincerity. However, why had he dragged him along? A cold smile spread across Ling Han's face as he looked at Tang Yuan. However, he remained silent. Tang Yuan instantly felt a mountain of pressure, with cold sweat pouring down his forehead. He had initially thought that he could trick Ling Han into Lu Li's residence. At that time, Ling Han would have no ability to cause a commotion. Now, however, Ling Han had already connected the dots before entering. "No need to worry. I didn't say that I wouldn't enter," Ling Han said with a smile. He wanted to see just what kind of grand and dangerous place this was. Tang Yuan instantly felt as if a huge load had been taken off his shoulders, and he hurriedly said, "Thank you, Big Brother Long. Thank you, Big Brother Long." His emotions were fluctuating so greatly that he even started to refer to Ling Han as Big Brother Long. The two guards were astonished upon hearing this. This person was far too freakish. Even Tang Yuan referred to him as Big Brother. Just who in the world was this? Chapter 2583, Stoking Flames. Chapter 2583, Stoking Flames. Tang Yuan didn't dare to enrage Ling Han, and he had also decided to yield to Lu Li. However, this didn't mean that any random person could bully him. He made a pushing motion with his hands. Pung, pung. The two guards were immediately sent flying. "Let's go." He recovered some of his might as a second-generation young master. However, because of his floral dress, all of this seemed extremely comical. Ling Han clasped his hands behind his back as he trailed after Tang Yuan. He was calm and relaxed, and he was extremely curious about why Tang Yuan had suddenly yielded. Moreover, he had yielded so comprehensively that he was even wearing a floral dress to please his once enemy. Interesting. They entered the residence, and it wasn't long before someone walked over to meet them. They didn't taunt Tang Yuan, and they simply led the way. The group walked to a garden, only to see that a huge feast was being held. There was a sea of guests. The person leading them suddenly stopped and shouted, "Young Master Tang has arrived!" His shout was so loud that he instantly attracted the gaze of everyone. Upon seeing Tang Yuan, these guests immediately spat out whatever was in their mouths, from wine to food. Some people were considerate, and they simply spat into the air. However, some of them directly spat the contents in their mouths onto other people's clothes. Laughter erupted, and the garden was filled with a sense of joy. Tang Yuan felt so humiliated that he wanted to crawl into a hole in the ground. He naturally understood that they were all laughing at him. As a young master, this was utter humiliation that he had never experienced before. He wanted to immediately turn around and leave. However, he wasn't stupid. Since his father had especially written that letter, this signified that things were extremely serious. If he dared to throw a tantrum, it was extremely likely that he would be beaten half dead by Tang Mingbo. At that time, he would still have to crawl over to please Lu Li. Thus, since he was destined to suffer humiliation, why would he choose to suffer a brutal beating on top of that? Zhao Shuang was also present, though he had been invited as a guest. Upon seeing Tang Yuan, he was naturally transfixed with shock. First, it was Yang Shaoling, and now it was Tang Yuan. It was as if Lu Li were on the same level as the Azure Ghost Celestial King. It was as if no one could hope to oppose him. Ha 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 ha. Lu Li roared with laughter as he appeared, followed by a crowd of young masters from Ghost King City. They all treated him as their leader. Yang Shaoling was also a focal point. She was as beautiful as a flower, and her seductive appearance was also as alluring as could be. She had always been a commanding figure among the young masters, yet at this moment she was like an obedient little bird as she followed Lu Li. At this moment, Lu Li was standing at the pinnacle of life. He couldn't be any more impressive. "Tang Yuan, I said that you would come, didn't I?" he said. Tang Yuan gritted his teeth, bowing in respect, and saying, "Young Master Lu is correct." This underling was blind before, and actually dared to oppose young Master Lu. This underling deserves a beating. After saying this, he started to slap himself again and again. Moreover, He used quite a lot of force. Lu Li roared with laughter. After Tang Yuan had slapped himself several dozen times, he said calmly, all right, I'll accept you as my underling. Just be smarter in the future, hear me? After all, Tang Mingbo was also a ninth heaven celestial king. Even though he possessed something that Tang Mingbo wanted, he still couldn't take things too far. Right now he had won enough face, so it was a good time to stop. Tang Yuan breathed a sigh of relief. He had truly been afraid that Lu Li would humiliate him further. Even though he had been humiliated now, this was still within what he could tolerate. He hurriedly smiled and said, "Thank you, young Master Lu. This underling will definitely listen to young Master Lu in the future. I'll do whatever you command me to do." Lu Li was extremely satisfied upon hearing this, and he wore a beaming smile as he nodded in acknowledgement. Tang Yuan looked over to Ling Han at this moment, shouting in a solemn voice, "Hurry up and kneel! Pay respects to young Master Lu." He was naturally doing this on purpose. He knew that Ling Han definitely wouldn't obey him, so he could seize this opportunity to sever all ties with Ling Han. Moreover, with Lu Li's current might and power, he would definitely exert pressure to force Ling Han to yield. At that time, they would directly lock horns. The best result would naturally be for Ling Han to directly kill Lu Li and then be killed by a ninth heaven celestial king. That would be the perfect scenario. Ling Han chuckled as he looked at Tang Yuan, saying, "Are you seeking death?" He didn't give a toss about the battle between the two profligates in Tang Yuan and Lu Li. However, if he were truly dragged into the conflict, he didn't mind causing a huge commotion before leaving. The Celestial King graveyard was massive, and many forces were hostile to one another. Thus, would the elites from Ghost King City dare to run to other territories to hunt him? "Li Long, it's only because of your decent strength that I endured your disrespect for so long. However, we're standing before young Master Lu now. Is this a place for you to act with wanton disregard?" Tang Yuan said in a baleful voice. Ling Han's reaction was naturally within his expectations. "I'm no match for you, but this is the residence of young Master Lu. Do you still dare to cause a commotion? Don't bring trouble onto yourself." Upon hearing this, the other young masters also started to speak, urging Ling Han to pay respects to Lu Li. "Do you think you're impressive just because you're a blood martial king? Are you stupid? Blood martial kings are merely a bit more powerful. However, are you not a dog still? Dogs should show the obedience of dogs. You're nothing but a measly third heaven celestial king." Their impression of Ling Han was still stuck in the past. They didn't know that Ling Han had already become a fourth heaven celestial king. This was because Ling Han hadn't unleashed his full strength while battling against Shi Yuan. He hadn't needed to. He had killed him with ease. These people were naturally sucking up to Lu Li, but this also made it difficult for Lu Li to take a backward step. Tang Yuan was already his underling now, and he had also admitted that he was unable to contain Ling Han. Moreover, this was his territory, so how could he allow Ling Han to act as he pleased? Thus, he had to suppress Ling Han. He naturally didn't dare to do this himself. He was only a second heaven celestial king, and he could only barely count as a king tier. Thus, could he even withstand a single strike from Ling Han? "Ayuan!" Lu Li shouted as he glanced to the side. Ayuan immediately stepped forward. He had been standing still the entire time, and it was as if he had fused together with the air. No one had noticed his existence. Now that he had stepped forward, however, it was as if he were a sword out of a scabbard, radiating with a dazzling and ice-cold aura. His radiance was brilliant, and it was as if he were a divine weapon. He had initially seemed as ordinary as could be, yet he was now surrounded by 4 ribbons of iridescent light. His right hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and his eyes were piercing and filled with terrifying killing intent. Fourth heaven celestial king. Ling Han was astonished. His cultivation was already advancing quickly enough, and he hadn't imagined that a UNS cultivation speed was also this quick. This youth couldn't be underestimated. His battle prowess was astounding. "You're very powerful, so why are you acting as a dog for these kinds of young masters?" Ling Han asked. Ayuan took several more steps forward, stopping 9 meters away from Ling Han. His body was slightly crouched like a wild beast, and it was as if he could unleash an earth-shattering battle prowess at any moment. "My master told me to protect him," he replied emotionlessly. Who's your master?" Ling Han asked. "Enough with the nonsense. Capture him." Lu Li roared in frustration. "Don't kill him. Leave him alive and make him suffer as much pain as possible. Show him the consequences of disobeying me." Ayuan didn't reply. However, he unsheathed his sword with a clang and pointed it at Ling Han. The atmosphere instantly became ice cold. "Are you going to surrender, or do you want me to suppress you?" he asked. Ling Han smiled and said, "If you unleash your full strength, perhaps you can withstand 100 of my attacks. However, if there's apprehension in your heart, you'll be defeated within 10 strikes." Ayuan's gaze jumped. He had remained cold and emotionless like a war soldier the entire time, yet he finally revealed a sliver of emotion at this moment. "Whoa!" The sound of a ringing sword traveled over. He had already drawn his sword and thrust at Ling Han's heart. Chapter 2584 Arrival of the Yin River Celestial King. Chapter 2584 Arrival of the Yin River Celestial King. The Regulation of Space. Ling Han was slightly astonished. When Ayuan had unsheathed his sword, a peculiar fluctuation had rippled across space. This was a sign of him wielding the regulations of space. It was also because of this that his thrust was so astonishingly quick. The sound of him unsheathing his sword had only just traveled over, yet the tip of his blade had already made contact with Ling Han's clothes. His mastery of the regulations of space was truly impressive. Otherwise, his thrust couldn't possibly have been so quick. Ling Han smiled faintly as he also wielded the regulations of space. An eerie scene appeared. Even though Ayuan continued to advance, with his sword continuing to thrust forth, he was unable to strike Ling Han no matter what. It was as if this mere half an inch had suddenly become an insurmountable distance. Ayuan frowned upon seeing this. He naturally realized what was going on. Ling Han was also using the regulations of space to oppose him. After reaching the Celestial King tier, what they used to do battle was none other than regulations. This was especially the case when both sides wielded the same regulations. In that case, the person who had more mastery over the regulations would gain an advantage. Was his mastery inferior to Ling Han's? Utterly impossible. He was a supreme monarch star, at the same cultivation level, who could suppress him. Freeze! With a wave of his left hand, he attempted to forcefully freeze space and trap Ling Han. Ling Han grinned and said, "I can shatter all regulations with my raw strength, and you still want to freeze me?" Pum! He punched at the air, and the space around him instantly shattered like glass. How could the regulations of space possibly trap him? One had to realize that Ling Han's body art was already powerful enough to face ordinary seventh heaven celestial kings head-on. As such, how could regulations at the fourth heaven trap him? Even supreme monarch stars couldn't succeed. Unleash your full strength, otherwise you'll be killed within 10 strikes, Ling Han said. He was brimming with confidence. Ayuan remained silent. However, he immediately brandished his sword and created a strange symbol. A devastating aura instantly emanated from his body, and it was as if a primordial beast had awoken and was roaring in rage. Whoosh! He unleashed a completely different sword technique, and his slash was so powerful that it was as if heaven and earth were about to lose their luster. Ling Han stepped back in retreat. Ayuan's battle prowess was far too terrifying at this moment. If Ling Han didn't unleash his full strength, it would truly be a struggle to deal with him. However, he still wanted to witness the might of this sword technique. so he merely retreated and allowed Yun to continue with his attacks. "Hurry up and capture him!" Lu Li shouted. He instantly regained his confidence after seeing Yun gain the upper hand. "Leave," Yun said coldly. Others didn't know, but he was extremely aware that Ling Han's battle prowess was superior to his. Right now, he could only suppress Ling Han because he had activated a secret technique, allowing his battle prowess to increase threefold. However, this wouldn't last for long. Moreover, it was clearly impossible for him to suppress and capture Ling Han in such a short amount of time. Thus, the only thing he could do was obstruct Ling Han. What? Lu Li was deeply astonished. He was extremely confident in Yun, as this was someone who could achieve victory even when he was at a disadvantage in terms of cultivation level. This was to say nothing about opponents at the same cultivation level. Now, however, Yun was actually telling him to leave. What did this signify? This signified that Yun lacked the confidence to defeat Ling Han. It was because of this that he was telling him to leave. Gasp! Even though Lu Li felt extremely displeased, he trusted Yun's judgment without reservations. This person didn't speak much, and he was definitely someone whose actions spoke louder than his words, since he felt like he was weaker than Ling Han. This definitely wasn't a case of him being humble. Instead, he was truly inferior to Ling Han. Lu Li immediately turned around to leave. Moreover, he was running instead of walking. If even Yun couldn't stop Ling Han, then he could only seek his father for help, or he could seek out that other person who was even more powerful than his father. Tang Yuan saw all of this, and a cold smile involuntarily appeared on his face. Wasn't Lu Li extremely mighty? Yet he was still scared off by his underling. Ling Han humphed as he dashed toward Lu Li like lightning. "Stay here!" Yun roared, wielding the regulations of space. His speed was also immense as he thrust at Ling Han's back. Ling Han furrowed his brows. Yun was extremely powerful, especially after he had activated some kind of secret technique. This caused his battle prowess to become even more powerful, so much so that even Ling Han didn't dare to face this attack head-on. He abandoned his pursuit of Lu Li, instead turning around to throw a punch at Yun's sword. Boom! His fist struck the tip of the blade, unleashing a devastating shockwave that instantly slammed the nearby people to the ground. However, Lu Li had been the first to flee, so he wasn't hit by this shockwave. He started to flee even quicker. No matter what, he was also a celestial kinga, second heaven celestial king at that. Thus, if he decided to flee, even fifth heaven celestial kings wouldn't be able to catch him. "Your opponent is me," Yun shouted in a cold voice. Ling Han shook his head, saying, "However, it's a shame that you're no match for me. I possess a peerless sword heart that can sever all matter," Yun said. His voice was calm, and his fighting spirit wasn't affected in the least. Ling Han roared with laughter, saying, "All right then, let us have a hearty battle." He unleashed his full strength, drawing on the great Tao with his hands. He then activated his body art, causing his battle prowess to directly soar to the seventh heaven. Regardless of how powerful Yun was, he was still limited by his aptitude as a supreme monarch star. Even though he had activated a secret technique to increase his battle prowess, how could this possibly rival Ling Han's body art? He was suppressed in all facets, instantly falling to a disadvantage. Tang Yuan and the others were all shocked upon seeing this. They hurriedly turned around to flee. Even Lu Li had fled, so it was clear that the situation had already spiraled out of control. That being the case, why would they stay here to seek death? Ling Han's fighting spirit was also excited, and he threw both of his fists forward. There was only battle on his mind. Pum! In just a dozen or so punches, Yun was struck and sent flying. Only after shattering 3 large boulders did he come to a stop. Even though he couldn't pick himself up no matter how he tried, his right hand still tightly gripped the hilt of his sword. not loosening in the slightest. Ling Han leaped up, dashing toward Tang Yuan. Since they had already fallen out, he would bring on bloodshed. He was far too quick, and he had only given chase a little after Tang Yuan had started fleeing. Activating the regulations of space, he rapidly closed in on Tang Yuan. Tang Yuan looked back, and his face immediately became green with fear. He hurriedly fled with all his might. However, with 3 quick flashes, Ling Han had already arrived behind Tang Yuan. He unleashed a single punch. Humph! Following a cold humph, a terrifying force slammed toward Ling Han, triggering the regulations of heaven and earth as it did so. This force transformed into a colossal palm that viciously thrust toward Ling Han. Apprehension instantly gripped Ling Han's heart. With a quick turn, he managed to successfully evade this strike. However, the devastating wind whipped up by this strike caused his clothes to flutter and his flesh to hurt. This was a formidably powerful person. Ling Han turned around, only to see a young man standing behind him. He was dressed in a gray robe that was decorated with a flowing river. Looking closely, however, he realized that this river was actually flowing in a tumultuous manner and radiating with an eerie aura. Most importantly, this person actually had 7 ribbons of iridescent light around him. A 7th heaven celestial king. Lord Yin River! Tang Yuan exclaimed. After escaping from the clutches of death, he couldn't help but feel boundless delight. Lord Yin River. This person was the Azure Ghost Celestial King's disciple, the Yin River Celestial King. The Yin River Celestial King wore a look of disdain as he glanced at Ling Han, saying, "After seeing me, you're still not going to surrender." Ling Han smiled faintly. Judging from his attack, this Yin River Celestial King was no ordinary 7th heaven Celestial King. Instead, he was a monarch tier. This signified that his battle prowess was infinitesimally close to the 8th heaven. It was no wonder that his attack had been so devastating. "If I want to kill someone, even you can't stop me," Ling Han said. Chapter 2585, Forcefully Killed. Chapter 2585, Forcefully Killed. The Yin River Celestial King couldn't help but laugh. A measly 4th heaven Celestial King actually dared to act so audaciously before him. He shook his head, saying, "Li Long, where in the world is your confidence coming from?" Ling Han didn't reply. Instead, his gaze was boiling with killing intent as it remained focused on Tang Yuan. This person actually dared to screw him over? He naturally had to pay a price for this. Tang Yuan continued to retreat. Ling Han's gaze was far too terrifying, so much so that it caused a cold chill to rise from the bottom of his heart. The Yin River Celestial King humphed and said, "Why are you retreating? With me here, can he hurt a single hair of yours?" Tang Yuan was placed in an extremely awkward situation. On the one hand, he was extremely afraid of Ling Han. On the other hand, however, the Yin River Celestial King was the disciple of the Azure Ghost Celestial King. Moreover, because the Azure Ghost Celestial King didn't have any children, the Yin River Celestial King was much like a son to him. He was dearly loved by the Azure Ghost Celestial King. Thus, did Tang Yuan dare to disobey him? If he didn't give him face, he would definitely suffer a miserable fate. He mustered all of his courage and forced himself to stop. However, he couldn't stop himself from shaking in fear. His legs felt like jelly. Ling Han cracked a grin, saying to the Yin River Celestial King, "Do you want to make a bet? I can definitely kill this person." "Impudence!" the Yin River Celestial King roared. He was a mighty 7th heaven Celestial King, yet Ling Han actually dared to act with such blatant disregard before him? This was unacceptable. "Just wait and see," Ling Han said. If he unleashed his full battle prowess and summoned his divine demon sword, it most likely wouldn't be a difficult task to rival the Yin River Celestial King. Moreover, Tang Yuan was far from the 7th heaven, so killing him wouldn't be too difficult, either. "Capture him!" The Ain River Celestial King roared. He lashed out again, extending his right hand. Hua, hua, hua. Several black rivers materialized, appearing much like black dragons as they slithered toward Ling Han. Without a word, Ling Han immediately summoned his divine demon sword. His battle prowess could only rival ordinary seventh heaven celestial kings. However, he definitely couldn't rival monarch tiers at the peak stage of the seventh heaven. Thus, refusing to use the divine demon sword would be akin to torturing himself. Celestial tool! The Ain River Celestial King exclaimed, involuntarily furrowing his brows. He hadn't been aware that Ling Han also possessed a celestial tool. Even though Ling Han had used the divine demon sword in the Tournament of Death before, he had only used it for a split second before sheathing it again. He hadn't exposed its true power. Moreover, it was only after receiving Lu Li's calls for reinforcements that the Ain River Celestial King had hurriedly rushed over. He hadn't had the time to do any research on Ling Han. As such, the appearance of the divine demon sword truly gave him a start. To celestial kings, possessing or not possessing a celestial tools were two completely different concepts. Before a celestial tool's might, even the Ain River Celestial King had to be extremely wary and careful. He had to dodge the divine demon sword's razor-sharp attacks. Otherwise, he would suffer an additional wound every time he was struck. If his vitals were struck, he would more so be sent into the afterlife. Ling Han cracked a grin, saying, "You're not going to flee." His words were aimed at Tang Yuan. Tang Yuan faltered upon hearing this. Judging from the situation, the Ain River Celestial King was completely unable to suppress Ling Han. Thus, if Tang Yuan remained, wouldn't he be seeking death? However, the Ain River Celestial King had already told him to stop fleeing. If he disobeyed and didn't give him face, what a difficult situation. The Ain River Celestial King's expression darkened. Just then, he had confidently proclaimed that he could suppress Ling Han with ease. To his surprise, however, his opponent was actually this terrifying. Even if it were a freak with an evolution index of 12, they would only be able to rival the sixth heaven while at the fourth heaven, right? Just what kind of freak was this? However, this was inevitable. Who would imagine that Ling Han could actually extract void particle energy to temper his physique, causing his body art to far surpass his cultivation level? Add to that the divine demon sword, and he could even rival monarch tiers at the seventh heaven. The Ain River Celestial King had to concede that even though Ling Han couldn't defeat him, he couldn't suppress Ling Han either. "Piss off!" he roared in frustration and embarrassment. Tang Yuan instantly heeded this delightful command, hurriedly turning around to flee. He had lost his face long ago, so he naturally didn't give a toss about fleeing before everyone. Ling Han waved his hand, instantly throwing forth a figure. "Go, kill him!" This was none other than Little Terror. This little guy possessed the highest cultivation level among Ling Han and the others. Right now, it had already reached the sixth heaven. Add to that the fact that he was a monster created by a dimension, and his battle prowess was naturally above his cultivation level as well. Otherwise, how could it live up to its name as a battle beast? Boom! It charged forward, catching up to Tang Yuan in just a few steps. It then widened its maws to chomp down at Tang Yuan. Its mouth instantly grew hundreds of times larger, and it was as if it were a mountain as it swallowed Tang Yuan with a gulp. Little Terror's mouth then immediately shrunk again. It smacked its lips as if it were enjoying the aftertaste. The Ain River Celestial King was absolutely stupefied. No matter what, he hadn't imagined that Ling Han had a celestial king tier great beast hidden on him. The adjective great wasn't based on size. Instead, it was based on cultivation level. This beast had already become a celestial king, so it was naturally a great beast. "Little Terror, come. Let's dispose of this person now," Ling Han said with a smile. Little Terror immediately plodded over, its large eyes filled with killing intent as it glared at the Ain River Celestial King. Ling Han spread his hands, saying, I already told you. If I want to kill someone, I'll definitely succeed. The Een River Celestial King forcefully suppressed his boiling rage. He then took a deep breath before saying, "Then are you going to kill me as well?" "Definitely, just not right now," Ling Han replied with a smile. The Een River Celestial King raised a brow. This person was truly audacious, even wanting to kill him. "Oh, then when are you going to act? That will give me some time to prepare as well, no? When I reach the fifth heaven or sixth heaven." "You won't have to wait for too long," Ling Han replied. The Een River Celestial King roared with laughter. "You still want to reach the fifth heaven or sixth heaven? What an absolute joke. You'll die here today." Ling Han smiled faintly, saying, "Rest assured, I'll leave before the ninth heaven's celestial kings receive news of this. There's no need for you to worry. Moreover, I'll also return from time to time, killing those I dislike." The Een River Celestial King exploded with rage upon hearing this. Ling Han's words implied that the Een River couldn't stop him at all. Moreover, Ling Han would still sneak back into Ghost King City from time to time, killing people such as Lu Li and the others, including even him. "Can you truly leave?" he said coldly. If a fourth heaven celestial king managed to calmly leave Ghost King City after wantonly killing someone, would the Een River Celestial King still have any face in the future? After escaping, young masters such as Zhao Shuang would definitely report the situation to their own fathers. Thus, ninth heaven celestial kings would definitely arrive here very soon. At that time, Ling Han's fate would be set in stone. Ling Han and Little Terror teamed up as they attacked the Een River Celestial King. Both of them possessed battle prowess at the seventh heaven, so they naturally gained an upper hand after teaming up. However, their advantage wasn't significant. After all, the Een River Celestial King's battle prowess was already approaching the eighth heaven. After battling for a while, Ling Han resolutely said, "Little Terror, let's go!" Little Terror growled in acknowledgement. The person and beast immediately ignored the Een River Celestial King as they fled from the city. The Een River Celestial King humphed as he gave chase. How could he allow Ling Han to flee? He was indeed slightly quicker than Ling Han and Little Terror. However, he didn't dare to get too close to them. After all, he had to dodge the attacks from the divine demon sword. Thus, he could only attack from a distance and cause some obstructions for Ling Han. This indeed created some troubles for Ling Han and Little Terror as they fled. However, it wasn't anything serious, and they quickly approached the city gates after just 30 minutes. Yet it was also at this moment that they heard a cold humph. A colossal hand reached over from the city, rapidly grabbing at Ling Han. The radiance of the great Tao flashed, exuding a paramount aura. This was the act of a ninth heaven celestial king. Chapter 2586, Hunted by Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings. Chapter 2586, Hunted by Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings. A ninth heaven celestial king lashed out, grabbing at Ling Han. Ling Han was extremely powerful and freakish, yet he was still no match for ninth heaven celestial kings as a fourth heaven celestial king. Each subsequent heaven was a completely different level. Right now, he could already challenge those three heavens above him, but this naturally couldn't be extended without limits. Fortunately, he had already prepared for this moment long ago. The instant that the colossal hand appeared, he had already grabbed Little Terror and tossed him into his spatial celestial tool. He then stepped forward, activating his teleportation skills. With a flash, he had already appeared in the distance. Pum! The colossal hand missed its target. However, it still flattened numerous houses, killing many who weren't even aware of what was going on. Some celestial kings were fortunate enough to survive, only suffering severe wounds. They groaned as they lay in the ruins, their faces filled with confusion. Just whom had they provoked to bring down such a harsh punishment? This was the Celestial King Graveyard, where elites could act as they pleased. Humph! There was a cold humph as the ninth heaven celestial king attacked again. Another colossal hand appeared, casting a shadow over the entire Ghost King city. Could Ling Han still escape? This was naturally impossible. A ninth heaven celestial king had already lashed out and more so locked his divine sense onto him. Ling Han was indeed quick, yet he was definitely not quicker than a ninth heaven celestial king. Thus, with a twist, Ling Han immediately descended to the ground. Upon landing, he immediately activated the heaven-deceiving technique, instantly transforming his appearance and aura. It was as if he had become a completely different person. He quickly mingled together with the crowd of shivering people. They were all terrified by the grand might of the ninth heaven celestial king. This was inside the city, where the terrain was extremely complicated. Thus, Ling Han could hide in any random building. The ninth heaven celestial king didn't slam his hand down. After all, his colossal hand was covering the entire Ghost King city this time. So if he truly slammed it down, he would kill at least 90% of the residents. Even he couldn't endure such a heavy loss. In reality, most wealth was created by ordinary people. Here, moreover, the lower-level celestial kings were also involved in another big secret. He couldn't massacre them as he pleased. Whoosh! A figure strode over in the sky, his body surrounded by 9 ribbons of iridescent light. He was none other than Lu Gaoquan, Lu Li's father. After Li had fled back to him, he had immediately used his divine sense to scan the entire city, quickly discovering Ling Han. He had then wanted to immediately lash out to capture Ling Han. However, because of the great distance, he was ultimately unable to unleash his full might. It was because of this that Ling Han had managed to dodge his attack. Otherwise, how could a measly 4th heaven celestial king dodge the attack of a 9th heaven celestial king? Lu Gaoquan stood with his hands behind his back as he scoured every inch of dirt. He was intent on capturing Ling Han. "My respects to Lord Lu," the Yin River celestial king said and clasped his hands as he flew over. He was the disciple of the Azure Ghost celestial king, and he was also a 7th heaven celestial king to begin with, so he didn't need to show too much respect and fear before Lu Gaoquan. Lu Gaoquan nodded and said, "Where did this young man come from? He was actually able to evade my attack? He's called Li Long, and he is a traitorous disciple from the world's paramount martial academy," the Yin River celestial king replied. Not long ago, he displayed his brilliant battle prowess at the Tournament of Death. This was all the information he had. Lu Gaoquan was astonished, saying, "You already rushed over, yet you still couldn't capture him?" He wasn't demeaning the Yin River celestial king. Instead, he was genuinely astounded. A monarch tier at the 7th heaven had actually failed to capture a 4th heaven celestial king? Who could believe this? The Yin River celestial king felt his face heat up, and he said, "The culprit had a celestial tool, so I didn't dare to face him head-on." Apart from 9th heaven celestial kings, who dared to face celestial tools head-on. However, Lu Gaoquan was still unable to accept this. This was a gulf of 3 entire minor levels, so it was akin to an adult man bullying a 6-year-old child. Thus, victory would still be easy even if the child were wielding a blade. The adult would simply need to be slightly more cautious. However, the Yin River celestial king had actually failed to contain Ling Han. This could only signify one thing. Ling Han's battle prowess was unfathomable. In fact, this could also be seen from the fact that Ling Han had dodged Lu Gaoquan's attack just then. That had been an attack of a 9th heaven celestial king. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Several more figures dashed over, all of them surrounded by 9 ribbons of iridescent light. These people were naturally the paramount higher-ups of Ghost King City. Just then, they had naturally been alarmed by Lu Gaoquan's colossal hand that had covered the entire city. "Lord Tang, I'm afraid that I have bad news for you," the Yin River celestial king said to one of the elites. "Your son was killed, and the culprit was none other than his own blood martial king. Right now, he's hiding somewhere below us. Tang Mingbo, instantly erupted in flames. He was crazy with fury, and he immediately unleashed a violent attack at the ground beneath them. Since the culprit was below them, he would kill everyone in the surroundings. Innocent people. Did that have anything to do with him? It was incredibly difficult for celestial kings to have offspring. He had already lived for several epochs, and it was only after entering the celestial king graveyard that he had finally had his own children. Thus, he naturally doted them to the heavens and back. However, the other ninth heaven's celestial kings hurriedly stepped forward to stop him. "Brother Tang, don't be rash. We naturally have to avenge your son's death. However, we have to minimize the damage that we cause. Otherwise, we'll all be in big trouble. He's nothing more than a fourth heaven celestial king, so we can definitely find him if we dig 10 meters into the earth. Moreover, Brother Tang, don't you think that it's too merciful to kill the culprit in a single strike?" Under their persuasion, Tang Mingbo finally agreed to cease his attack. With a dash, he immediately descended to the ground. "Come out, all of you. I'll give you 3 seconds. Otherwise, I'll kill everyone still in hiding," he said in a baleful voice. His voice boomed through the surroundings, reaching every nook and cranny. 1, 2, 3. 3 seconds passed by in a flash, and figure after figure dashed over from all directions. They were all stern as they stood before Tang Mingbo, and each of them stood relatively far from one another. This was the celestial king graveyard, where each person only believed themselves. Thus, who dared to stand too close to another person? Were they not afraid of being suddenly killed? Being killed here would be completely futile and worthless. Tang Mingbo swept his gaze over them. They all wore expressions of respect and fear, and there was also a hint of confusion on their faces. They weren't feeling pure fear. He furrowed his brows and said, "Confirm your identities with each other. Point at the people that you recognize." He was confident that Ling Han would definitely be exposed if he were hiding among these people. After all, none of these people would be familiar with him. At that time, the odd person out would be the culprit that he sought. However, he had clearly underestimated the cautious nature of these people. This was the celestial king graveyard, so who would make friends and socialize for no reason? Elites like him were naturally different. People would become his followers, so he could naturally build his own force. However, ordinary people could only rely on themselves and treat everyone else as an enemy. They wouldn't make any contact with other people. Thus, only a measly few dozen people confirmed the identities of each other. Meanwhile, the large majority of people remained silent and unmoving. "Fuck!" Tang Mingbo almost swore in frustration. This was his brilliant plan, yet it had proven to be a foolish endeavor in the end. He was just about to speak, yet his expression suddenly faltered. A cold smile spread across his face, and he said, "I told everyone to come out just then. Haha, did you think I wouldn't discover you if you hid?" He ferociously grabbed at a building. Chapter 2587, Fool. Chapter 2587, Fool. Tang Mingbo naturally didn't believe that Ling Han would obediently hand himself over. Thus, he had continued to use his divine sense to scan the surrounding area, determining whether anyone remained hiding in the houses or inside a spatial god tool. Just then, he had discovered an extremely faint fluctuation. This was the fluctuation of a spatial god tool. With his cultivation as a ninth heaven celestial king, he could already enjoy an equal status with the great Tao. So just how sensitive was his divine sense? He immediately determined that there was a living being inside this spatial god tool. Thus, he resolutely concluded that Ling Han was hiding inside. He immediately attacked without any reservations. Pum! Just as his large hand was about to grab the house, there was a deafening rumble as the house self-destructed first. A large black hand reached out, blocking Tang Mingbo's hand. The owner of this hand was definitely extremely powerful, with his strike directly shattering Tang Mingbo's large hand. Huh. Lu Gaoquan and the others had all been absent-minded just then. Yet, at this moment, they all wore surprised expressions. In fact, they were slightly astounded. The ability to block Tang Mingbo's strike proved that this person was definitely no weaker than him. This definitely wasn't Ling Han. "Friend, who are you? Why are you hiding?" Lu Gaoquan shouted. "Ha! Do you people insist on forcing me out?" an old voice replied. An elder with a hunched back slowly trod upon space as he walked into the air. This person was truly very old, with his back so hunched that he looked like a shrimp. There was a cane in his hand, and all of his hair had already become white. There was no ribbon of iridescent light around him, and it was clear that he had purposefully suppressed his aura. However, upon seeing this elder, Lu Gaoquan and the others all inhaled a sharp breath, wearing expressions of utter shock. "Zhan Feiyu!" they exclaimed in unison. Zhan Feiyu was an old generation celestial king who had already reached the 9th heaven long ago. Moreover, he wasn't a resident of Ghost King City, and he was instead the most powerful subordinate of prosperous Opening City's city lord. His status was equivalent to that of Ghost King City's Yang, Quebec. More importantly, prosperous Opening City was at odds with Ghost King City, with both sides yearning to defeat and conquer the other. In the Celestial King graveyard, even though human life was worthless, it was also the most valuable resource at the same time. Right now, a pillar of the opposing force had secretly hidden inside Ghost King City. What were they planning to do? Hang on. Why had Ling Han fled here? Oh, indeed. Ling Han was definitely a member of prosperous Opening City. He had been sent here, though it was unclear what his exact aim was. In any case, he had caused a huge commotion, so he had fled here to seek help from Zhan Feiyu. Ha! What an utter fool! He had exposed Zhan Feiyu just like that. Otherwise, it was truly hard to say when they would have discovered Zhan Feiyu's existence. At that time, perhaps he would have already succeeded in his plan and caused catastrophic damage. After all, he was the second most influential person in prosperous Opening City, so could his scheme be small? This being the case, they truly needed to thank Ling Han. They needed to thank this utter fool. They were sure that Ling Han was definitely hiding in Zhan Feiyu's spatial god tool at this moment. Thus, as long as they could capture Zhan Feiyu, they could also capture Ling Han. Meanwhile, Ling Han also wore an expression of shock as he stood among the crowd of people. He had chosen a random direction to flee in, yet he had actually dragged another 9th heaven celestial king into this mess. Moreover, this person seemed extremely freakish. Sure enough, Ling Han was a big troublemaker. He could drag people into trouble no matter where he went. His ability was as powerful as could be. He secretly stepped back in retreat. Even if he stayed to watch the show, he would need to watch from a safe distance. After all, a battle between 9th heaven celestial kings would be far too terrifying. Even the shock waves from their battle would be devastating and fatal. Right now, Zhan Feiyu was definitely the most frustrated person. In fact, he had already hidden here for several years, not coming across a single hitch. So, what in the world had gone wrong? Why had he been exposed? Moreover, judging from Lu Gaoquan and the others' expressions, they seemingly hadn't known about this, either. They had only found him by accident. He had truly suffered great misfortune. Which bastard had dragged him into their mess? His meticulous plan was now at risk of evaporating into smoke. This infuriated him greatly. If he found out who the culprit was, he would definitely hack them to death. No, hacking them to death wouldn't be enough. He would severely wound them and then heal them to full health. He would then repeat this again and again several hundred times before killing them. Zhan Feiyu suppressed his frustration and anger before saying, "Since I've been exposed, I'll take my leave now. I'll also give you all a warning. Following as your ghost will only lead to a bad fate. It's better for you to surrender to prosperous Opening City, where we can take part in a magnificent cause together." He decided to leave, Yet he still didn't forget to sling some mud at the Azure Ghost Celestial King. Even if this was futile, he could still mess with their minds a little. Zhang Feiyu, can you escape? Tang Mingbo said in a baleful voice. The culprit who had killed his son was hiding inside this person's spatial god tool. Moreover, he involuntarily thought of many more things at this moment. Perhaps it had all been a scheme of prosperous opening city. Perhaps they had purposefully targeted his son. He had to avenge his son. Zhang Feiyu truly wanted to curse. Tang Mingbo's glare was far too piercing and ferocious. It was as if he had killed his father or son. What in the fuck was this? Even if he were expressing loyalty toward Azure Ghost, there was no need for his act to be so serious, right? He humphed and said, "If Azure Ghost doesn't come out, who can stop me?" He was a monarch tier, so he was much more powerful than ordinary Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings. In reality, Lu Gaoquan, Tang Mingbo, and the others were all Emperor tiers. If it weren't for the environment of the Celestial King graveyard, perhaps they might have been stuck at the first heaven for their entire lives. Of course, in the Celestial realm, it was essentially impossible for Emperor tiers to advance to the Celestial King tier. However, this was a transcendent dimension, so there were also infinite possibilities. "What about me?" a voice suddenly said in a calm manner. Another Ninth Heaven Celestial King suddenly appeared. "Yang Ke!" Zhang Feiyu exclaimed, his pupils immediately contracting. He looked toward this Ninth Heaven Celestial King. Yang Ke was the second most powerful person in Ghost King City. He had the appearance of a handsome and carefree young man in his 20s, and there were also semi-spheres on the back of his two hands. If they were combined, they would form the yin and yang symbol. Zhang Feiyu wore a solemn expression. Yang Ke was no weaker than him, so if they engaged in battle, it would be extremely difficult to determine a victor. Moreover, there were several other Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings present. Even though they were all weaker than him, their combined battle prowess naturally couldn't be ignored. If they ganged up on him, he would be in huge trouble. However, the most terrifying person was naturally the Azure Ghost Celestial King. If Zhang Feiyu were trapped, and the Azure Ghost Celestial King came over, the former would truly face certain death. "Brother Zhang, since you've come to Ghost King City, why didn't you give me a heads up? I was unable to fulfill my duty as a host. Why don't you stay for some tea? We can discuss cultivation over tea." "That sounds like a fairly good plan, no?" Yang Ke said. His voice was calm and composed. Zhang Feiyu chuckled and said, "I'm an extremely busy person. How about Brother Yang coming over to prosperous opening city next time?" He didn't hesitate a single bit as he turned around to leave. He didn't give the Celestial Kings a chance to surround him. Yang Ke was the first to move as he stepped forward, as quick as lightning. After reaching the Ninth Heaven, perhaps not even 1 in 100 million people would advance to become a heavenly venerate. Thus, they all had sufficient time to cultivate more regulations. Moreover, the regulations of time and the regulations of space were naturally the two most likely regulations for them to cultivate. Thus, the speed of most Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings was fairly similar. As long as their aptitude was similar, their grasp of the regulations of time and regulations of space would also be fairly similar. This was unless it were a newly advanced Ninth Heaven Celestial King who hadn't had the time to cultivate these regulations yet. Thus, it was extremely difficult for Celestial Kings to pursue fellow Celestial Kings. This was especially the case for Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings. Without an advantage in cultivation, and without an advantage in regulations, how could they possibly catch up? Chapter 2588 Unexpected Return. Chapter 2588 Unexpected Return. Zhang Feiyu fled, while Yang Ke gave pursuit. Behind them, there was also a trail of Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings from Ghost King City, all of them traveling at immense speed. However, the initiative was in Zhang Feiyu's hands since he had fled first. Thus, as long as he wasn't obstructed, he wouldn't need to worry about getting caught. This was already the outskirts of the city to begin with, so with the speed of ninth heaven celestial kings, they could genuinely exit the city in just 2 or 3 steps. A relaxed expression appeared on Zhang Feiyu's face. At the same time, however, there was also a hint of fury. He had actually been forced to scurry like a rat. He was truly unwilling to accept this. Since you've already entered Ghost King City, don't you want to stay for a little longer? A voice suddenly said with a cold chuckle. An eerie azure hand that was colossal in size suddenly reached over from the center of the city, slamming over at an incredible speed. This was a skeletal hand, completely azure in color and as uncanny as could be. Zhang Feiyu instantly shuddered in fear. This was the hand of the azure ghost, celestial king. He didn't dare to face this attack at all. Otherwise, if he were obstructed by this hand and surrounded by Yang Ke and the others, he definitely wouldn't be able to flee. However, the speed of the skeletal hand was incredible, and this was most likely a strike that the Azure Ghost Celestial King had been preparing for a long time. Pum! The hand slammed into Zhang Feiyu's back, causing him to violently vomit blood. However, Zhang Feiyu didn't stop at all. Instead, he continued to flee with all his might, crashing through layers of space and shooting forward hundreds of kilometers in an instant. He successfully exited the city. When a ninth heaven celestial king was intent on fleeing, it was truly difficult to stop them. Tang Mingbo bellowed in rage, continuing his pursuit as he roared, "Old bastard, stop right there!" The culprit who had killed his son was hiding inside Zhang Yufei's spatial god tool, so how could he let him flee? Even though Zhang Feiyu had already fled far into the distance, Tang Mingbo's bellow had also contained some divine sense fluctuation. Thus, he was able to hear him clearly. This caused him to feel extremely vexed. He hadn't done anything, yet he was being chased and beaten as if he were a rat. Moreover, even a weakling such as Tang Mingbo dared to act so arrogantly toward him? Which bastard had screwed him over? No, he couldn't scurry away just like this. He had to make head or tail of the situation. Otherwise, he would become an absolute joke. Without knowing where he had gone wrong, his scheme of countless years had been ruined just like that. Following the escape of Zhang Feiyu, Yang Ke and the others also dispersed, going back where they had come from. After all, was there any point in remaining? However, this encounter also gave them a timely warning about just how poor the defenses of Ghost King City were. The second-in-command of an opposing force had already infiltrated their place, yet they hadn't known about it at all. Thus, they naturally had to strengthen their defenses. Otherwise, if Prosperous Opening City had launched an invasion, they would have only learned about it when the enemy forces would have been already in the city. Ling Han wore a strange expression. He truly hadn't imagined that things would have taken such a wild turn. By the looks of things, Lu Gaoquan and the others most likely believed that he had already fled Ghost King City. If he made an unexpected return now, Ling Han casually strolled around, randomly finding a place to rest. He decided to return to Lu Li's residence tonight. Not a single person would be prepared for his unexpected return. After half a day, he secretly snuck into Lu Li's residence. His aura was completely hidden. After all, he was here to hunt, so he naturally didn't want to become the hunted instead. With his improved heaven deceiving technique, even first-tier heavenly venerates wouldn't be able to see through him. Thus, even if there were ninth heaven celestial kings present, Ling Han still wouldn't need to worry about being caught. Even so, he still remained cautious as he scoured the courtyard, because he was afraid that there might be ninth heaven celestial kings present. Ling Han naturally didn't dare to release his divine sense. Otherwise, if he were caught, he would have nowhere to flee. After snooping around for a while, he arrived in a building where he could faintly hear some conversation. He immediately recognized one of the people as Lu Li. "Found you." He became increasingly careful, silently sneaking over and peeking through the crack in the door. Thanks to the heaven-deceiving technique, even fourth heaven's celestial kings would fail to notice his existence when walking past him. After all, this was a technique that could deceive even the heavens, to say nothing of people. There were only two people in the room. One was Lu Li, and the other was also a young man. However, even though he looked young, and even though there were no ribbons of iridescent light around him, Ling Han had a feeling that this person was definitely more powerful than him. Moreover, this person's appearance bore slight resemblance to that of Lu Li. However, he definitely wasn't Lu Gaochu, and Ling Han had seen Lu Gaoquan before. "Are you all right?" the young man asked Lu Li. "Thank you for your concern, uncle. Your nephew is feeling fine," Lu Li replied respectfully. "Uncle, this person is Lu Gaochuan's brother? Huh. I don't think I've heard of this person before. Hang on, was it because of the sudden appearance of this uncle that Lu Li suddenly enjoyed an explosive rise in power? And thus Tang Yuan was forced to surrender and even wear a floral dress? Otherwise, things can't be explained. However, even if he's a ninth heaven celestial king, what right does he have to force Tang Mingbo to lower his head? Perhaps he's even more powerful than the Azure Ghost celestial king. Ling Han became increasingly careful, channeling the heaven-deceiving technique to perfection. If he were discovered by a ninth heaven celestial king at such close range, he would definitely be caught. Lu Gaochuan's brother was called Lu Gaojian, and his eyes were filled with doting as he said, "I heard that you were almost killed by an evil person, and this made me extremely uneasy. If I hadn't been discussing an important matter with Azure Ghost at the time, I definitely wouldn't have allowed the culprit to escape." Lu Li was extremely moved upon hearing this. He felt like this uncle who he had only just reunited with loved him even more than his father. He hurriedly replied, "If uncle had been there, that Li Long would have definitely been killed on the spot. If he had the opportunity, he would curry as much favor as he could. This would allow his status to rise at a meteoric rate. Indeed, he could even bed Yang Shaoling by force. This was all thanks to his relationship with Lu Gaojian. Uncle, your discussions with Lord Azure Ghost are far more important. Your nephew wasn't in any great danger," Lu Li said obediently. He understood how to please his uncle. However, Lu Gaojian shook his head, saying, "No one in this world is more important than you. When I catch the culprit, I'll definitely dice him into 10,000 pieces." As he said this, a terrifying killing intent erupted from his eyes, ice-cold and menacing as could be. Lu Li was extremely moved. This uncle treated him far too well. As an outsider, however, Ling Han considered many more things. This uncle treated his nephew far too well. Gasp! Lu Li isn't his biological child, is he? As an outsider, Ling Han was able to see things far more clearly. The way that Lu Gaojian looked at Lu Li was the way that only a father would look at his son. Fuck, this is far too messed up. Lu Gaojian lightly tapped his armrest as he said, "Prosperous Opening City is scheming to obtain Ghost King City, and this is something that I'm already aware of. However, why did they send someone to assassinate you? What benefit does this bring them? Unless Wang Yun is already aware of my matters?" Wang Yun was the lord of Prosperous Opening City. Lu Gaojian frowned and continued, "But that's impossible. I've already kept an extremely low profile, so they definitely can't be targeting you because of your relationship with me. Strange. Where did things go wrong?" No matter how he racked his brains, he couldn't come up with a logical explanation for the recent events. He had come to Ghost King City with a mission, and apart from the ninth heaven celestial kings, only Lu Li knew of his existence. Thus, how could this intel have been leaked to Prosperous Opening City? How could they have cooked up a plan to target them? It was only natural that he couldn't make head nor tail of the situation. This was because it had all been one big coincidence. Ling Han giggled in his mind. To say nothing of Lu Gaojian, even heavenly venerates would get a headache if they were present. After all, everything had been a coincidence and a misunderstanding. Thus, How could there be any logical explanation? Lu Gaojian paused for a moment before retrieving a jade seal. He handed it to Lu Li and said, "Take it. There's a cultivation technique inside, and I want you to switch to practicing this from tomorrow onward." Chapter 2589, Heavenly Venerable Tier Cultivation Technique. Chapter 2589, Heavenly Venerable Tier Cultivation Technique. Lu Li accepted the jade seal and asked curiously, "Uncle, what kind of cultivation technique is this?" "This is the 9 Transformations Divine Scroll." Lu Gaojian replied with a serious expression. "Divine Scroll?" Ling Han's heart jolted upon hearing this. Only Heavenly Venerable Tier cultivation techniques could be referred to as divine scrolls. Celestial King Tier cultivation techniques could only be referred to as celestial scrolls. Lu Gaojian actually possessed a Heavenly Venerable Tier cultivation technique? This was simply astounding. Had he dug up some Heavenly Venerate's grave? It was no wonder that Lu Li's status had suddenly soared. This was clearly thanks to his relationship with Lu Gaojian. Because of this, even Tang Mingbo had been forced to bow his head in submission. In fact, even the Azure Ghost Celestial King was showing favor toward him now. Otherwise, the incident with Nyoda in the tournament grounds wouldn't have occurred simply because of the Yin River Celestial King's words. Thinking back, why had the Yin River Celestial King purposefully targeted Ling Han? This was naturally because of Lu Li. The aim was to suppress Tang Yuan, and Ling Han simply became the victim. Fortunately, he had been powerful enough to resist and kill Nyoda instead. The source of all this was none other than Lu Gaojian. 9 Transformations Divine Scroll. Lu Li murmured. He still hadn't realized that this was a Heavenly Venerable Tier cultivation technique. The 9 Transformations Divine Scroll was created by a Heavenly Venerate. Lu Gaojian said slowly and calmly. "What?" Lu Li instantly exclaimed in deep astonishment. His hands involuntarily started to tremble. This was a Heavenly Venerable Tier cultivation technique. Just how paramount and mighty was this? Lu Gaojian smiled faintly. He was extremely satisfied with Lu Li's reaction. He nodded and said, "This Heavenly Venerate was called the 9 Transformations Heavenly Venerate. However, he already died several epochs ago." "Heavenly Venerates can actually die?" Lu Li asked in disbelief. Just how lofty and paramount were Heavenly Venerates? With a single finger, they could easily crush 9th Heaven Celestial Kings to death. Yet Lu Gaojian was actually saying that such a Heavenly Venerate had died. Just how could Lu Li believe this? In this world, there only exists indomitable power. However, there doesn't exist an invincible person, Lu Gaojian replied calmly. Lu Li's breathing quickened as he asked, "Whom was the 9 Transformations Heavenly Venerate killed by?" "A truly peerless individual," Lu Gaojian replied, a slight quiver in his voice. It was as if he were feeling apprehension at the mere thought of this person. "Who?" Lu Li pressed. Lu Gaojian paused for a moment before replying. "You don't have the right to know about this right now, so there's no need to keep asking. You only need to know that this cultivation technique left by the 9 Transformations Heavenly Venerate can give you an opportunity to reach the Heavenly Venerable Tier." Gasp! Lu Li's hands trembled even more violently. An opportunity to reach the Heavenly Venerable Tier? In his eyes, even the 9th Heaven was but a distant dream. Now, however, his uncle was saying that he could potentially become a Heavenly Venerate. How could he not shake with excitement? This was absolutely unbelievable. However, Ling Han shook his head upon seeing this. A Heavenly Venerable Tier cultivation technique was indeed paramount and profound. However, being able to become a Heavenly Venerate simply by obtaining such a cultivation technique? What an absolute joke! Otherwise, wouldn't the large black dog have become a Heavenly Venerate long ago? Wouldn't the Imperial Void Celestial King, Dongfang Rui, and Xianrong all have become heavenly venerates? No, no, no. Practicing heavenly venerable tier cultivation techniques might even cause one to lose themselves in the fervent pursuit of Tao, resulting in them being stuck at the ninth heaven even though they originally had the potential to ascend to the heavenly venerable tier. In the end, it might result in them being ultimately unable to take that most important step. Perhaps Lu Gaojian had learned of this from someone else, and it was because of this that he believed it without question. After all, this was an opportunity to become a heavenly venerate, which ninth heaven celestial king wouldn't be wild with excitement, so much so that they forgot all other matters. However, regardless of this, Ling Han still wanted to snatch this 9 transformations divine scroll for himself. It wouldn't hurt to investigate it. As if handling a paramount treasure, Lu Li carefully put away the jade seal. This isn't the entirety of the 9 transformations divine scroll, Lu Gaojian suddenly said. Huh. Disappointment instantly spread across Lu Li's face. Silly child, if this were the complete 9 transformations divine scroll, you wouldn't be able to comprehend it at all. Lu Gaojian said with a chuckle. The 9 transformations divine scroll consists of 9 scrolls in total, with each expounding on a different great Tao and a different regulation. With each scroll that you grasp, your battle prowess will increase by several folds. When you grasp all 9 scrolls and integrate them together, you'll more so have an opportunity to charge through that barrier and become a heavenly venerate. Lu Li immediately became excited again, saying, Then, uncle, do you have the complete 9 transformations divine scroll? I don't, Lu Gaojian replied with a shake of his head. However, there's a mighty figure who's in possession of the complete 9 transformations divine scroll. As long as we serve him to the best of our abilities, he'll generously bestow us with more scrolls from the 9 transformations divine scroll. There were flames of eagerness in Lu Li's eyes as he asked, Uncle, can we both become heavenly venerates? Definitely. Lu Gaojian replied with a smile. He gazed up at the sky before continuing, Moreover, we can definitely leave this godforsaken place as well. From that moment on, we'll be able to roam free and mighty, not bound by the restrictions of this heaven and earth anymore. He paused for a brief moment before saying, Have a good rest. When you wake up tomorrow, you can start practicing the 9 transformations divine scroll. Aim to comprehend it as soon as possible. If you come across anything you don't understand, don't hesitate to directly come to me and ask. Your cultivation level is still low, and I initially wanted to pass the 9 transformations divine scroll to you only when your cultivation level became higher. However, because of the incident with Ling Han, Lu Gaojian had decided to raise the strength of his nephew. He didn't want to feel sorrow and regret for a lifetime. He took his leave. Whoosh! With a flash, he immediately disappeared from sight. However, how could Lu Li rest at this moment? He was far too excited. He retrieved the jade seal and pressed it to his forehead, absorbing the information inside it. However, he immediately felt a cold chill, which caused him to involuntarily put the jade seal down. He was overcome with shock. This was because someone had suddenly appeared behind him. Hey, he wanted to call a Yuan, yet he immediately recalled that a Yuan had been severely wounded in the battle during the day. Right now, a Yuan was still lying on a bed. He was far too accustomed to having a Yuan protect him, so he had subconsciously tried to call him for help. Ling Han wore a beaming smile as he said, You don't mind giving this to me, right? He reached over to take the jade seal. At this moment, how could Lu Li possibly oppose him? He couldn't do anything at all, and the jade seal fell into Ling Han's hands. The gulf in battle prowess between them was a whopping 5 heavens. This was no longer just a crushing advantage. This was already a galactic advantage. Who are you? Don't you know that you're bringing huge trouble upon yourself? Lu Li said in a quivering voice. Oh, so you don't recognize this appearance of mine? Ling Han mused. Right now, he wasn't disguised as Li Long. Instead, he was showing his true appearance. With a single thought, he immediately reverted to his original appearance. Why you? It's you!" Lu Li exclaimed in terror. His face became as white as a sheet. He definitely hadn't imagined that the intruder was actually Ling Han. How could he be so audacious? He had only just left in the morning. Yet, he had already snuck back at night. "You finally recognize me now?" Ling Han said with a chuckle. He hadn't imagined that there would be a day when others didn't recognize his true appearance. Instead, it was actually his false identity that was mighty and infamous. "Don't you do anything crazy. My father and my uncle are both ninth heaven celestial kings, and my uncle is more so working for a supremely powerful person right now. If you dare to touch even a single hair of mine, you'll definitely meet a tragic end," Lu Li said in threat. Ling Han immediately reached over and tugged, ripping a large handful of hair from Lu Li's scalp. Lu Li screamed in agony, his voice astonishingly loud. In fact, he wasn't truly hurting so much. Rather, he was screaming so loudly in order to give a signal, telling others that he was in danger. Ling Han smiled faintly and said, "Don't harbor such futile hopes. I've already sealed the surrounding space, so no one will hear you even if you scream your lungs out." Lu Li's face instantly became ashen. Perhaps other fourth heaven celestial kings wouldn't be able to block his calls for help. However, if Ling Han said that he was able to, then he was definitely able to. This person was far too freakish. Lu Li shook in fear, terrified of the fatal threat that stood before him. In fact, he was the same as Tang Yuan. He was nothing more than a profligate, second-generation young master. When he had power, he would act with as much arrogance and haughtiness as he could. However, when he was in an inferior position, he would lose all composure and courage. Chapter 2590, Luring the Enemy Away. Chapter 2590, Luring the Enemy Away. "Tell me about your uncle," Ling Han said. He was extremely curious about Lu Gaojian's background and the supremely mighty figure that he had spoken of. This was someone who could causally bestow a heavenly venerable tier cultivation technique upon someone. Just who was he? His boldness was simply astonishing. Lu Li didn't dare to conceal anything at all as he comprehensively revealed everything to Ling Han. In the past, the two brothers Lu Gaoquan and Lu Gaojian had offended a powerful force. After being captured, they weren't executed, but instead tossed into the Celestial King graveyard. After arriving here, the two brothers worked together for many years. However, because of a woman, they ultimately went their separate ways. This woman was none other than Lu Li's mother. Ling Han was able to guess even more things. Perhaps Lu Gaoquan had discovered that Lu Gaojian was having an illicit relationship with his wife, so the two brothers had turned against each other. Whether or not this was true wasn't important. In any case, Lu Gaoquan was truly a fortunate person. After so many years, he surprisingly hadn't been killed, and he had instead become a ninth heaven celestial king. Meanwhile, Lu Gaojian was even more impressive. Not only had he become a ninth heaven celestial king, but he had even become acquainted with a mighty figure and come to Ghost King City as his representative. He was treated as an esteemed guest, and all of the other ninth heaven celestial kings were trying to suck up to him. This was because he was in possession of the 9 transformations divine scroll. Only through him could these celestial kings obtain part of the 9 transformations divine scroll. This was a prison that everyone wanted to escape. However, unless they became a heavenly venerate, they wouldn't have the power to break out by themselves. Ling Han asked about the supremely mighty figure, yet Lu Li didn't know a single thing about this person. This was because Lu Gaojian had kept his lips sealed regarding this person. "How useless can you be? Is there any point in leaving you alive?" Ling Han said, "Don't kill me. I'll give you anything you want." Lu Li begged. "No need for so much trouble," Ling Han said as he threw a punch. Pung! Lu Li's head instantly exploded into smithereens. Ling Han immediately turned around to leave. Once news of Lu Li's death spread, commotion would definitely engulf the city once again. After finding a hidden location, Ling Han reverted to his true appearance and entered his spatial celestial tool. He then started to investigate the 9 transformations divine scroll with the Empress and Bewitching Maiden Row. The cultivation levels of Lu Yutong and the others were far too low, so they naturally couldn't comprehend the cultivation techniques of heavenly venerates. Indeed, Ling Han had only been able to practice the indestructible heavens scroll, thanks to the help of Black Tower. Otherwise, it would have simply been impossible. After pressing the jade seal to his forehead, countless symbols immediately started to churn in his mind. However, these symbols were mystical and complicated, and Ling Han was unable to comprehend the secrets hidden within them. This was a heavenly venerable tier cultivation technique, after all, so how could it be learned so easily? However, Ling Han had practiced the indestructible heavens scroll before, so he immediately came to a realization. Even though this cultivation technique was hard to grasp, trying to comprehend it wouldn't be insurmountably difficult. The 9 transformations, Heavenly Venerate, hadn't split this cultivation technique into 9 scrolls in order to purposefully make things difficult for others. Instead, this was a decision filled with wisdom. It was only by splitting the cultivation technique into 9 scrolls that it could be grasped by celestial kings. Otherwise, even monarch tier 9th heaven celestial kings would only be able to comprehend a tiny amount of its essence after countless years of cultivation. After grasping one scroll, one could use this as a foundation to practice the next scroll. In such a way, one could gradually grasp more and more of the 9 transformations divine scroll. Of course, it was no easy task to link and fuse 2 different scrolls of the 9 transformations divine scroll together. This is a heavenly venerable tier cultivation technique, so it's indeed worth learning. The 3 of them started to earnestly investigate the cultivation technique. Time quickly flowed by, and it was as if they had completely forgotten about the outside world. This cultivation technique was indeed worthy of their time and effort. While they cultivated in peace and quiet, Ghost King City was experiencing tumult and unrest. Lu Li had been killed. If this had been before, Lu Li's death would have still caused some commotion, but he was still nothing more than a second-generation young master, after all. At most, it would have only enraged Lu Gaoquan and made him want to kill someone as he scoured the city for the culprit. This time, however, things were very different. This was naturally because of Lu Li's uncle, perhaps his father. After learning of Lu Li's death, Lu Gaojin was even more enraged and frenzied than Lu Gaoquan. Moreover, as a representative of that supremely mighty figure, he also had a humongous influence over Ghost King City. Thus, the entire city instantly fell into commotion and unrest. People were hunting for the culprit everywhere. The biggest suspect was naturally Zhang Feiyu. He had seemingly left Ghost King City, but he had in fact snuck back at night and carried out another assassination. This old fucking bastard, he truly deserved death. They naturally wouldn't be able to find Zhang Feiyu in the city. Thus, Lu Gaojian made a request to the Azure Ghost Celestial King, asking him to deploy troops to attack prosperous opening city to exact revenge for Lu Li. However, the Azure Ghost Celestial King was neither stupid nor reckless. He could accept cooperation with the supremely mighty figure that Lu Gaojian represented for the sake of obtaining the 9 transformations divine scroll. In fact, he would even be willing to serve this person. However, he definitely wouldn't be so reckless as to engage in conflict with prosperous opening city simply for the sake of Lu Gaojian. Of course, this was unless Lu Gaojian could provide him with an army that was no weaker than that of Ghost King City. With the 2 forces combined, attacking prosperous opening city wouldn't result in too many losses. The 2 parties couldn't come to a consensus, so any discussions about attacking prosperous opening city naturally became moot. 3 years later, Ling Han was the first to exit his state of cultivation. He now had a preliminary grasp of the 9 transformations divine scroll. The indestructible heavens scroll focused on defense, tempering one's physique and increasing one's recovery ability. Meanwhile, the 9 transformations divine scroll focused on offense, with each scroll requiring one to cultivate a different great Tao. By fusing all 9 great Tao together, one would be able to transcend the regulations and comprehend a peerless power. This scroll of the 9 transformations, divine scroll, focused on the great Tao of metal. Metal, a representation of intensity and killing intent. Ling Han raised his hands. His left hand was encircled by the simple regulations of metal, while his right hand was encircled by the great Tao of metal summoned through the 9 transformations divine scroll. He threw a punch with both hands, striking 2 different boulders. The boulders in the Celestial King graveyard were all extremely tough and sturdy. Even though both boulders cracked open after being punched, one only split into 7 pieces, while the other was smashed into smithereens. The one smashed into smithereens had been struck by his right hand. Ling Han could guarantee that he had used the same amount of power in both fists. However, the results were as different as could be. This was evidence of the 9 transformations, divine scrolls' immense power. After fusing all 9 scrolls together, the resulting might will be unfathomable. Ling Han said with emotion, "This was the cultivation technique of a heavenly venerate, after all, which heavenly venerate wasn't a supreme prodigy." "How I wish to obtain the other scrolls," Ling Han murmured to himself. Through Lu Gaojian, the supremely mighty figure was using this 9 transformations divine scroll to recruit the Azure Ghost Celestial King and the others. Even though the ability to become a heavenly venerate was definitely a lie, the value of this cultivation technique was still astounding. This place seemingly harbors many secrets. If the ascending dragon pill can be mass-produced in the outside world, it can definitely transform the power of the entire dimension. And this 9 transformations divine scroll, why does a heavenly venerable tier cultivation technique exist in this place? And what is that mighty figure scheming? Ling Han mulled over this for a moment, but he naturally couldn't make head nor tail of the situation. He exited the spatial celestial tool and started to hunt down the 2nd-generation young masters in the city. Who could stop him? Ghost King City instantly descended into commotion and unrest again. Many high-level celestial kings were infuriated, taking this as a sign of severe provocation from prosperous opening city. They had no option but to counterattack. This time, even the Azure Ghost Celestial King couldn't suppress the combined rage of the Celestial Kings anymore. He decided to deploy a large army to attack prosperous opening city. The large army was quickly gathered together and deployed, with the Azure Ghost Celestial King personally going with them as well. Add to that Yang Ke, Lu Gaojian, and many other Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings, and it could be said that this was a vast and mighty army. Ling Han stood atop the city walls as he gazed at the large army disappearing into the horizon. A faint smile involuntarily tugged at the corners of his lips. He had successfully lured his enemies away. Now he could visit the Azure Ghost Celestial King's residence and comb through it, figuring out the secrets behind the ascending dragon pill. Chapter 2591, Brahmin Celestial Flower. Chapter 2591, Brahmin Celestial Flower. Ling Han had always been very curious about the ascending dragon pill. Just how was this pill refined? It could actually help those with mediocre talent reach the Celestial King tier. In fact, it could even help them progress through the Celestial King tier. This was extremely abnormal. Transcendent dimensions were indeed impressive and powerful. However, this was over the top. In any case, a city lord should be very wealthy, right? Ling Han stealthily made his way to the city lord's residence. He was extremely careful as he snuck around, and using his heaven-deceiving technique and his own skills, It was as if he were entering a realm with no other person. The Azure Ghost Celestial King wasn't present, so it was extremely likely that no one would discover Ling Han even if he didn't use the heaven-deceiving technique. The Ain River Celestial King didn't reside here, either, and he instead lived in a different place, even though there were still a few Sixth Heaven Celestial Kings patrolling the residence. This naturally wasn't enough to put Ling Han in any danger. He simply needed to remain cautious. In fact, it was his lack of familiarity with this place that was the biggest challenge. He had no choice but to run around in circles and search for the treasures of the Azure Ghost Celestial King room by room. Thus, it took him until midnight to finally find what he wanted. This was a study. However, there existed a small formation that isolated an area of space. If it had been any other ordinary Fourth Heaven Celestial King, they definitely wouldn't have discovered this area. In fact, even Seventh Heaven Celestial Kings might have failed to discover it. However, Ling Han was well versed in the regulations of space, so even the smallest bit of imperfection could catch his attention. Thus, he had immediately locked his gaze on the small formation. However, discovering this formation was one matter, and being able to open it was another matter. This was a formation laid out by a Ninth Heaven Celestial King. After all, with the complicated formation symbols extremely difficult to understand and resolve. Ling Han wasn't pressed for time, however, as the battle between the two cities would naturally take longer than a day or two. Moreover, others generally wouldn't enter this place, so he could naturally take his time as he investigated this formation. Sure enough, Ling Han took his time with the formation. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Time continued to flow by. Along with it, Ling Han's understanding of the formation also started to grow. All kinds of comprehension started to pop up in his mind. In fact, these comprehensions were extremely helpful to his cultivation as well. Half a year later, delight finally appeared on Ling Han's face. He had resolved the formation. This had truly been grueling work. Ling Han wiped his forehead. Even though there was no sweat, he felt like he had just been engaged in an intense battle. For the past 6 months, he had been engrossed in his investigation of the formation. In fact, he had even accelerated time such that the 6 months had already become over 500 years for him. Spending 500 years to resolve a formation laid out by a Ninth Heaven Celestial King wasn't slow at all. In any case, this was all thanks to the absence of the Azure Ghost Celestial King. Otherwise, how could Ling Han have stayed here for 6 months? Were Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings mere decorations? After unlocking the formation, what appeared before Ling Han was a small space that contained many ascending dragon pills. Ling Han naturally took all of these. There was no need to be polite. Apart from these, he also discovered a pill recipe. This was the pill recipe for the ascending dragon pill. Ling Han glanced over it, and a look of deep astonishment spread across his face. This was because the ingredients for the ascending dragon pill were as simple as could be. In fact, the only ingredient was the fruits of Brahmin celestial flowers. A single ingredient. Perhaps only the lowliest alchemical pills would require a single ingredient. Yet the ascending dragon pill was clearly a valuable celestial king tier pill. This was inconceivable, unfathomable. Not only that, but the method to concoct the ascending dragon pill was also extremely simple. To say nothing of 5-star grandmasters, even amateur apprentices would be able to concoct it with ease. This was far too abnormal. It was as if the fruits of Brahmin celestial flowers were already semi-finished products. No, not semi-finished, but close to 99% finished. The so-called refinement process was nothing more than performing some packaging. What in the world is this Brahmin celestial flower? I feel like I've heard Tang Yuan mention it before. Ling Han racked his brain for an answer. Back then, Tang Yuan had told him about winning a gamble with Zhao Shuang, from which he had obtained a few Brahmin celestial flowers. Ling Han hadn't paid much heed at the time. However, with his memory, he would never forget what he had heard. Thus, with some thought, he was able to recall this conversation. It seems like many celestial kings are cultivating this type of celestial medicine. Ling Han left the residence of the city lord. Right now, he wanted to find the herbal garden of the azure ghost celestial king. He wanted to see this Brahmin celestial flower for himself. The location of the garden wasn't a secret, and he was able to quickly obtain it after asking around a little. However, when Ling Han arrived, he discovered that it was actually being guarded by an eighth heaven celestial king. He could rival ordinary seven heaven celestial kings, and he would need to summon his divine demon sword and unleash his full strength if he came across monarch tier seventh heaven celestial kings. If his opponent were slightly more powerful, however, he would be unable to rival them. After all, the gulf in cultivation level wasn't so easy to overcome. If I obtain all 9 scrolls of the 9 transformations divine scroll and comprehend all of them, I can most likely rival celestial kings such as the Yin River celestial king even without using my divine demon sword. However, I'm unable to do that now. I'm more so no match for 8th heaven celestial kings. Ling Han didn't have blind confidence in his own abilities. Only when recognizing one's own strengths and weaknesses could one be regarded as an elite. Otherwise, they wouldn't be far from death. With an 8th heaven celestial king standing guard, Ling Han naturally couldn't have his way with the herbal garden. However, it wasn't only the Azure Ghost celestial king who owned a herbal garden in the city, and it wasn't only the Azure Ghost celestial king who raised Brahmin celestial flowers. Thus, Ling Han could look for other targets. Whom should he target? Ling Han's eyes lit up. He had killed several second-generation young masters recently, and this was the fundamental reason behind Ghost King City waging war on prosperous Opening City. However, as the death toll piled up, the 9th heaven celestial kings naturally increased their defenses as well. Afterward, it became increasingly difficult to carry out his assassinations. Thus, some of the second-generation young masters were still alive. For example, Zhao Shuang and Yang Shaoling. Ling Han decided to pay Zhao Shuang a visit. Since he could offer Brahmin celestial flowers for a gamble, he most likely had some understanding of them. Ling Han visited Zhao Shuang's residence first. However, after the numerous assassination cases, Zhao Shuang had already moved to his father's residence. Compared to freedom, staying alive was far more important. Zhao Shuang's father was called Zhao Yuanyi, and he had naturally followed the Azure Ghost Celestial King to war. He obviously couldn't stay to look after his son, just because the latter hadn't been killed yet. Moreover, since Zhao Yuanyi had already joined the battle, he would naturally have to give his full commitment. Otherwise, they would be defeated by prosperous Opening City one by one. As such, Ling Han charged into Zhao Yuanyi's residence. Of course, he was still extremely careful and cautious, keeping an eye out for any potential traps. After all, who knew if a 9th heaven celestial king would suddenly pop out? He continued to sneak forward, not releasing his divine sense to scan the surroundings. Even so, it was still fairly easy to find Zhao Shuang. The latter was currently in a large hall enjoying a feast with his friends. There were beautiful women performing for them, with their clothes extremely revealing and their movements extremely exaggerated and seductive. Some of the second-generation young masters were extremely profligate, with their arms around the beautiful maidservants and their hands feeling them up and down. However, Zhao Shuang appeared fairly disinterested, and it was as if something was weighing heavily on his mind. One of his underlings raised his glass and said, "Brother Zhao, why are you in such low spirits? Come, let's have a drink." Zhao Shuang nodded in acknowledgement, raising his glass and clinking it with that of his underling. He then put the glass to his lips in a perfunctory manner. Another underling walked over and said, "Brother Zhao, are you worried about that Li Long person?" All of the lords have personally gone to fight against prosperous Opening City, so how would they dare to carry out such assassinations again? There's no need to worry, Brother Zhao. That's right. The lords will definitely force prosperous opening city to hand over the culprit. After dragging him back, they'll cut him into pieces. Moreover, this is also beneficial to you, Brother Zhao. Everyone found this strange. Li Long had instilled fear and apprehension in everyone's heart. So why was this person claiming that this was beneficial? The person who had spoken and astonished everyone smiled calmly and said, "Those who enjoy equal status with Brother Zhao have mostly been killed off already. That being the case, won't Brother Zhao be the sole leader of Ghost King City in the future?" Chapter 2592, Interrogation. Chapter 2592, Interrogation. That's right. Zhao Shuang's eyes lit up, thinking about it carefully how many second-generation young masters could still rival his status. There were a few, but only a very measly few. In this sense, he truly needed to express his gratitude toward the killer. This person had eliminated many of his opponents, allowing him to act even more wantonly among the second-generation young masters. Oh, indeed. We actually failed to realize this. Ha ha ha. Brother Zhao is about to become a peerless individual. We need to wholeheartedly thank that killer. Hopefully he assassinates a few more people, allowing Brother Zhao to become the most powerful young master. Everyone roared with laughter. If Zhao Shuang became the most powerful young master, their status would naturally soar as well. Zhao Shuang's mood immediately improved. He had been extremely worried over the past few days, afraid that the killer might appear in his room at any moment. However, thinking carefully, not a single assassination had occurred in the past 6 months after the lords had marched off to battle. It was clear that the culprit was also under a lot of pressure and didn't dare to act so wantonly anymore. With this in mind, Zhao Shuang immediately felt at ease. He raised his glass and started to drink with everyone else. Ling Han had initially wanted to act after Zhao Shuang finished his feast. However, these people were far too profligate, and they continued to drink with no end in sight. They showed no signs of ending the feast. With the energy of celestial kings, they could drink for 10 years straight without any problem. Ling Han gave up on waiting. He had already familiarized himself with this residence. There was only a single seventh heaven celestial king standing guard, and this person was indeed powerful enough to be his opponent. However, Ling Han was confident that this celestial king wouldn't notice anything out of the ordinary if he acted now. Ling Han silently activated the regulations of space, sealing off the entire hall. This way, he wouldn't need to worry even if he caused a huge ruckus. The seventh heaven celestial king wouldn't be able to detect any abnormal fluctuation. After finishing his preparations, Ling Han materialized in the hall. Ling Han's sudden appearance caused everyone to falter. However, in the next instant, they all stared at him with their faces ashen and their mouths agape. Li Long. They had just been speaking about him, and now he had truly arrived. In fact, they had just been wishing for him to kill a few more second-generation young masters, thereby allowing their brother Zhao to become the sole leader of this generation. However, they had instead brought this misfortune upon themselves. Li Long, someone stammered, their lips quivering in terror. Guards! Save me! Commotion instantly broke out, with everyone screaming for their lives. They all knew that they were no match for Ling Han. Thus, they could only ask powerful elites to come over to save them. Ling Han paid no heed to this. With his divine sense enveloping the area, he could easily grasp the situation inside the hall. Here, the most powerful celestial king was only at the second heaven. Moreover, they were only an emperor tier. In other words, he could kill them with a single thought. Li Long, what do you want? Zhao Shuang asked as he forced himself to calm down. He needed to buy time so that the seventh heaven celestial king could rush over to save them. Ling Han smiled faintly, saying, "I'm here to ask you a few questions." He sat down before turning to the trembling maidservant next to him and saying, "Please pour me some wine, thanks." The maidservant shuddered before hurriedly pouring Ling Han some wine. She was born in the Celestial King graveyard, and because she was only at the severing mundane tier, she was treated like mud in this place. In Ling Han's eyes, however, she was nothing more than an innocent person. Thus he treated her with respect. "What do you want to know?" Zhao Shuang asked, his voice becoming increasingly calm. However, only he knew just how violently his heart was beating. After drinking a glass of wine, Ling Han stood up and said, "There are too many people. All of you enter." He reached out, grabbing a person and tossing them into his spatial celestial tool. Everyone's expression changed drastically. Li Long was finally revealing his murderous nature. They needed to flee. They screamed in fear as they rushed toward the exits. However, when they reached the door, they were horrified to discover that there was seemingly an invisible wall blocking their way. They couldn't leave the hall no matter what. What's going on? Why couldn't they leave the hall? And why wasn't the seventh heaven's celestial king coming to save them? They were already screaming their lungs out. Were the people outside deaf? Ling Han casually reached around, grabbing Celestial King after Celestial King and tossing them into his spatial celestial tool after sealing their cultivation. After a dozen or so times, only the maidservants, dancers, and Zhao Shuang remained. Zhao Shuang was collapsed on his chair. He wanted to move, but he was so petrified that he couldn't even move a single finger. Ling Han reached over again, sealing Zhao Shuang's cultivation and tossing him into his spatial celestial tool as well. He then turned to the maidservants and dancers with a smile, saying, "Sorry for frightening you all." With a flash, he vanished without a trace. Ah! At this moment, piercing screams instantly cut through the entire Zhao residence. Whoosh! The seventh heaven celestial king immediately dashed over. However, fury instantly spread across his face when he saw the scene before him. Terrifying killing intent coursed through his body. Ling Han arrived at a hidden place in the city before entering his spatial celestial tool, where he started to interrogate Zhao Shuang. Zhao Shuang was trembling in fear, and no tears were forthcoming even though he wanted to bawl. This was truly karma. He had still been wishing for Ling Han to kill more second-generation young masters so that he could become the one and only, and Ling Han had indeed snuck over again. However, Ling Han's target was him. If he had known this, he definitely wouldn't have wished for such matters. Ling Han patted Zhao Shuang's shoulder, saying, "I have a few questions for you." "Brother Long, please ask away," Zhao Shuang hurriedly said. As long as he could live, he wouldn't mind abandoning his temperament as a second-generation young master. He was willing to become an obedient dog. Ling Han nodded and asked, "How much do you know about Brahmin celestial flowers?" Huh. Zhao Shuang was astonished. He hadn't imagined that Ling Han would actually ask about this. "How what? Hurry up and answer me," Ling Han said with a glare. "The fruits of Brahmin celestial flowers are the main ingredient for refining ascending dragon pills. They're incredibly valuable," Zhao Shuang hurriedly replied. "This simple. That's all you know," Ling Han said in disappointment. Upon seeing the murderous glint in Ling Han's eyes, Zhao Shuang's heart involuntarily jolted. He hurriedly added, "Brother Long, I can bring you to where my father cultivates Brahmin celestial flowers." Ling Han chuckled and said, "Perhaps you want the celestial king guarding that place to kill me and then rescue you?" Zhao Shuang had indeed been thinking about this. After all, Brahmin celestial flowers were far too valuable. Thus, even though his father had gone off to war, he had still left a trustworthy and powerful subordinate to guard the herbal garden. He definitely couldn't risk any accident. However, upon hearing Ling Han's words, he hurriedly shook his head. In fact, he shook his head so hard that it was as if he were about to shake it off his neck. "I wouldn't dare to. How could this underling dare to have such thoughts? Brother Long, you're overthinking things." Ling Han retrieved a pill and tossed it to Zhao Shuang. "Swallow it." "Brother Long, what pill is this?" Zhao Shuang asked with a bitter expression. A poisonous pill, of course, Ling Han answered calmly. Huh. Zhao Shuang had already been about to swallow the pill. However, upon hearing Ling Han's words, he immediately stopped his motion. This is a slow-acting poison, Ling Han said. Swallowing it won't kill you right away. However, you'll only have 3 days. Once 3 days pass, if you don't get my antidote, you can only pray to the gods. Zhao Shuang was no fool. He naturally understood what Ling Han meant. If he dared to pull any tricks, perhaps Ling Han would be killed. However, Zhao Shuang would definitely be killed as well. I understand. Chapter 2593, Hidden Secret. Chapter 2593, Hidden Secret. Zhao Shuang's expression was ashen as he swallowed the poisonous pill. He felt as if he had nothing more to live for. Ling Han chuckled in his mind. Where would he get a poisonous pill from? He had merely done this to frighten Zhao Shuang. However, in order to convince Zhao Shuang, he purposefully used some techniques to make Zhao Shuang feel intense pain in his abdomen. This pain was tolerable, yet it definitely couldn't be ignored. Zhao Shuang was a cowardly person, and it wasn't long before he collapsed, saying, Brother Long, I feel like the poison is about to spread. Hurry, give me the antidote. Pum! Ling Han sent him flying with a kick. If this pill weren't produced by him, he might have truly been fooled by Zhao Shuang's terrified expression, and he might have been fooled into thinking the poisonous pill was genuine. Enough with the nonsense. Hurry up. Ling Han didn't waste any time as he dragged Zhao Shuang along. News of Zhao Shuang being kidnapped would definitely spread throughout the city in no time. Even though the herbal garden was in a remote location, it was still only a matter of time before the news spread over. Thus, Ling Han had to enter and exit the herbal garden before this news arrived. This herbal garden was indeed located in an extremely remote location. It was hidden inside a desolate mountain, yet it was still protected by formations on all sides. There was also an 8th heaven celestial king standing guard. Ling Han had entered the spatial celestial tool long ago, and only Zhao Shuang remained walking in the outside world, with the spatial celestial tool hidden on his body. This was a risky plan. If Zhao Shuang suddenly discovered some courage and asked the 8th heaven celestial king for help, Ling Han would immediately become trapped. Even if he could flee, he would definitely have to pay a huge price. However, Ling Han was an audacious person, and he was also convinced that a profligate second-generation young master like Zhao Shuang would definitely value his life above all else. He wouldn't dare to bring them both down together. Zhao Shuang took a deep breath and wiped the expression of fear and anxiety from his face. He then reverted to his temperament of a profligate second-generation young master as he strode into the mountain. Zhao Shuang, you've come to steal medicines again, someone said in a mocking tone. Zhao Shuang felt his eyes blur, and before he knew it, there was already a person standing before him. This person had 8 ribbons of iridescent light around him, and he was none other than the celestial king who was guarding the herbal garden. Zhao Shuang's heart burned, and he almost spat out a call for help. However, he immediately recalled Ling Han's calm expression that seemingly hid an infinite amount of confidence. A cold chill involuntarily ran down his spine. One had to realize that many 9th heaven celestial kings had been sent out to hunt for him back then. However, they had still failed to capture Ling Han. In fact, all of this was a misunderstanding that had been caused by Zhang Feiyu's sudden appearance. However, in terms of the end results, this was indeed true. Moreover, people who heard this story wouldn't consider so much. They would simply think that Ling Han was an incredibly freakish person even 9th heaven celestial kings couldn't capture. Thus, Zhao Shuang naturally had even less confidence in an 8th heaven celestial king. If Ling Han managed to escape, who would give him the antidote for the poisonous pill? With this in mind, he immediately poured a bucket of cold water over his burning heart. Uncle Sue, you jest. I'm only here to take a look, he said. You say this every time, but when have you ever been honest? The eighth heaven celestial king said with a smile. However, he still waved his hand, saying, Go ahead. This was Zhao Yuani's command. As long as Zhao Shuang didn't take things too far, he could allow him to steal some Brahmin celestial flowers. This was his son, after all. Zhao Shuang nodded in acknowledgement before walking into the mountain. After taking a few steps, he couldn't help but steal a backward glance. He felt a strong urge in his mind, yet he ultimately didn't open his mouth. After Zhao Shuang ventured deep into the mountain, Ling Han exited his spatial celestial tool. He had already channeled the heaven-deceiving technique. So as long as he didn't attack anyone, even ninth heaven celestial kings wouldn't be able to detect his existence. Of course, this was unless they saw him with their eyes. This was a herbal garden in which many celestial medicines were being cultivated. However, many of them were extremely young, rendering them useless to celestial kings. They needed at least a few more epochs before they could be of any use. Ling Han was even more astonished upon seeing this. Even celestial king-tier great herbs were extremely difficult to cultivate, so why were ascending dragon pills so abundant in number? Theoretically speaking, didn't Brahmin celestial flowers require several epochs to grow and produce fruit? This would in turn severely limit the production of ascending dragon pills. Brother Long, this is the place, Zhao Shuang said as he pointed at a plot of land. Ling Han looked over. These are Brahmin celestial flowers. This was an extremely eerie and colorful type of plant. Its stem was bright red as blood, and its leaves were purple and filled with azure veins. These colors would instantly grab one's attention. Some Brahmin celestial flowers were already blooming, with their flowers as large as fists and their petals extremely lush and healthy. Their colors were more so extremely attractive. Some were still flower buds, while some had already produced fruit, which were similarly colorful. Ling Han walked over for a closer look. These flowers were extremely colorful. In fact, they were so colorful that they seemed eerie and bewitching. Ling Han couldn't help but feel a sinister aura from them. This wasn't an illusion. Ling Han could smell blood. Ling Han turned around and asked, What are these flowers watered with? Brother Long, I feel like I can't breathe. Did you calculate the time wrong? Is the poison already spreading? Zhao Shuang was extremely anxious and uneasy, and he didn't hear Ling Han's question at all. Pa! Ling Han gave him a good slap, finally waking him up. Zhao Shuang cradled his face in grief as he said, Brother Long, why did you hit me? I asked you a question. Zhao Shuang shuddered, but he still asked, Brother Long, what did you ask? Ling Han shook his head before repeating his question again. I don't know, Zhao Shuang replied with a shake of his head. Ling Han didn't ask any more questions. In the eyes of this second-generation young master, there was nothing more to it than Brahmin, celestial flowers, and astonishing wealth. As for how these Brahmin celestial flowers were cultivated, Zhao Shuang didn't care at all. As Ling Han continued to observe the Brahmin celestial flowers, a speculation slowly formed in his mind. After a while, he suddenly shuddered before turning to Zhao Shuang and saying, Someone's coming over. Don't give away any clues. Whoosh! He entered the spatial celestial tool. Sure enough, it wasn't long before someone walked over. This was a fifth heaven celestial king. After seeing Zhao Shuang, he hurriedly greeted him in respect, saying, This underling pays his respects to young master. Zhao Shuang nodded in acknowledgement. The fifth heaven celestial king walked up to the field of Brahmin celestial flowers before sweeping his hand and tossing forth numerous corpses. There were the corpses of humans, beasts, birds, and many more. However, they were all celestial kings. Even though they had died, they still radiated with a powerful aura that couldn't be faked. Zhao Shuang's eyes widened in disbelief. This was because Ling Han had only just asked about this a moment ago, so he was able to immediately connect the dots. Sure enough, the fifth heaven celestial king chopped the corpses of the celestial kings into pieces, transforming them into blood, water, and bone scraps as he buried them in the field. His movements were practiced, and it was as if he had already done this many times before. Thus, he was able to finish his task in no time. He then turned to Zhao Shuang, nodding, and said, "This subordinate will take his leave now." Zhao Shuang was still transfixed with shock, so he simply gave a stiff nod of acknowledgement. After the celestial king left, Ling Han reappeared once again. His expression was solemn. Sure enough, it was as he had speculated. Before, he had always been curious about why ascending dragon pills only existed in the Celestial King graveyard. Moreover, the effects of these pills were so potent and heaven-defying. Now, the answer had finally appeared before him. This was because Brahmin celestial flowers were cultivated using the corpses of celestial kings. This was equivalent to using celestial kings to raise more celestial kings. Moreover, this behavior would definitely lead to a huge waste of resources. Perhaps the corpses of 10 celestial kings could only raise a single celestial king. However, this didn't matter. This was the Celestial King graveyard, so a large number of celestial kings would be sent here each year, providing them with a large amount of resources. It was no wonder why so many celestial kings without a powerful background were also tossed into this place. This was the fundamental reason. Hang on. If ascending dragon pills can't be taken to the outside world, why do the celestial kings in the outside world need to do this? Why do they insist on tossing these celestial kings inside? Gasp. Ling Han instantly came to a realization. This was very likely related to a colossal black market. Chapter 2594. Studying the Real Body. Chapter 2594. Studying the Real Body. In the outside world, there had to be forces stretching out their hands, enabling them to obtain the ascending dragon pill. Perhaps there was not just one such force like this. Furthermore, because of the effects of the ascending dragon pill, the forces that were involved in this profitable business had to be extremely powerful and might even have heavenly venerable tier background. Otherwise, how could they bring out the ascending dragon pill? Putting himself in the shoes of another, if Ling Han was a heavenly venerate himself, what would he do to obtain the ascending dragon pill? Send a 9th heaven celestial king here. Moreover, it had to be one that was extremely strong in terms of battle prowess, the kind that could conquer a city. In that case, they could then obtain a great number of celestial king tier bodies, allowing them to cultivate the Brahmin celestial flowers on a large scale. At a certain time, he would then move, unlocking the celestial king graveyard, and retrieve the ascending dragon pill. This was not jailbreak, so it was not difficult for them to achieve this. Otherwise, they could use the excuse that the celestial king that they had sent was training here, and retrieve both their subordinate and the alchemical pill itself. For example, the black donkey would retrieve Ling Han after 100 million years. So how could it be that other heavenly venerates could not do something similar? Ling Han frowned deeply. This should be a massive black market chain of profits. If he touched it, he could possibly be targeted by a heavenly venerable. Perhaps it was not just one heavenly venerate, either, but a few or even more than that. I do indeed have a halo of calamity on me, he mused ruefully. He had entered this place only for the sake of battle, so he could rapidly increase his own cultivation level. He had not expected that he would come into contact with such a great matter. Naturally, he could just stand by and watch. In any case, the majority of celestial kings that had been tossed here were all deserving of their punishment. I don't know what's the matter, but I keep having a feeling something is off. Ling Han pondered deeply. Even if he had discovered the secret of the ascending dragon pill, this was equivalent to having a considerable number of celestial kings being sacrificed for the sake of a single celestial king. However, as an alchemist, he still could not accept this kind of alchemical pill completely. Alchemical pills were never as simple as that. If it was expanded in this manner, then wouldn't it mean that the refinement of over a dozen celestial king tier great herbs produced the same effects as the ascending dragon pill? No way. So how could the ascending dragon pill do this? Ling Han could not explain it, but with the instincts of an alchemy emperor, he felt that the Brahmin celestial flowers were not as simple as something nurtured with the flesh and blood of celestial kings. He plucked 2 Brahmin celestial flowers, which he stowed into the spatial celestial tool. He could slowly study them in the future. Then Zhao Shuang led him away. How could Zhao Shuang dare to say anything else? He immediately left with his spatial celestial tool, and did not even bring any Brahmin celestial flowers with him. That was because he knew that if he did take any with him, he would still have to surrender them to Ling Han. When he left, that 8th heaven celestial king came out to take a look. When he discovered that only 2 Brahmin celestial flowers had been taken, he allowed Zhao Shuang to leave easily. Otherwise, he would definitely make Zhao Shuang hand over the Brahmin celestial flowers. After leaving At present, Ling Han had already found out all that he should know. Hence, should he still continue staying in Ghost King City? After thinking for a while, Ling Han decided to stay. It was precisely because there were a great many 9th heaven celestial kings that all wanted to capture him that this would give him enough pressure so that he could maintain this rapid increase of his cultivation level. Then let's have a fair fight. Ling Han's fighting spirit blazed hotly. The greater the pressure, the higher his fighting spirit would soar. Furthermore, his character was also very stubborn. You people want to capture me and kill me, but I will choose to stay here and bring trouble to you. Moreover, he also wanted to find out the origins of that mysterious, powerful figure from Lu Gaojian. Who exactly was he? Previously, he did not understand, but now, because of the ascending dragon pill, it was possible that this involved the contest among several powerful forces, which were all fighting over the market for Brahmin celestial flowers. That was because the more power their subordinates grasped, the more Brahmin celestial flowers they could cultivate. Correspondingly, the more ascending dragon pills there would be as well. If this thing was brought outside, it would be something that could change the power structure of a world. Zhao Shuang's disappearance naturally caused a great commotion inside the city. This meant that the mysterious murder had not practiced any restraint because of the invasion of the Azure Ghost Celestial King and the others against prosperous opening city. He had once more stretched out his hand to do evil. Yet, thinking from another aspect, was it prosperous opening city that could no longer hold up to the pressure and had to use this kind of method to force the invading troops into retreat. The people of Ghost King City did not know, because the distance between the 2 cities was too large. Another year passed, and the invading troops finally returned. A great many celestial kings were injured, and there were also a considerable number that would never be able to return. However, the Azure Ghost Celestial King gave an announcement that caused great excitement, and that was that they had won. They had forced prosperous opening city to pay an extremely exorbitant price in exchange for stopping the assault of their troops. However, once they returned to the city, Lord's residence, the expressions of all the 9th heaven celestial kings darkened. Though they were victorious, their losses were also tremendous. More importantly, they had made a great mistake. That was because that Li Long was not from prosperous opening city at all. Zhang Feiyu had even placed a Dao oath and claimed that he did not know Li Long at all and had completely no links to Lu Li's death at all. A Dao oath could still be trusted. Thus, the Azure Ghost Celestial King and the others were certain that Zhang Feiyu should have just happened to bear the blame for Ling Han. However, whether it was Zhang Feiyu or prosperous opening city, neither of them could remove themselves from the matter entirely, because they had indeed been scheming against Ghost King City. The 2 sides did not continue fighting, because though the side of Ghost King City had the upper hand, it was not a crushing advantage. If they did not withdraw their troops, then even if Ghost King City's side could win, it would be a Pyrrhic victory, and their strength would drop to rock bottom. By then, other forces could take the chance to attack them, and that would be equivalent to them having paved the way for others. That Li Long, who exactly is he? The Azure Ghost Celestial King asked gravely. Master, according to my investigations, This person should have just recently entered into the Celestial King graveyard. The Ain River Celestial King immediately stepped out and related his information about Ling Han. Actually, it was nothing secret. Ling Han had overcome various opponents in the tournament grounds and was extremely bold and invincible. This was something that was known to everyone. It is definitely abnormal for a mere fourth heaven Celestial King to possess such battle prowess, Tang Mingbo declared gravely. By now, he had completely calmed down. Fury had no use to him when trying to avenge the death of his son. True. The Azure Ghost Celestial King nodded in agreement. To say nothing of Supreme Monarch stars, even if their evolution index had reached 12, there's no possible way he could match a seventh heaven Celestial King when he himself is only in the fourth heaven. He should be holding a colossal secret, Lu Gaoquan said and glanced at Lu Gaojian. Could it be that he, too, holds the secret of heavenly venerable tier? All the Celestial Kings exclaimed in shock. This was the only way to explain it. Because they were all ninth heaven Celestial Kings, they definitely could not think of any other means that could allow a fourth heaven Celestial King to ignore the overwhelming suppression of cultivation level and be powerful to such a vicious, sinister extent. Since a heavenly venerable tier secret technique could appear here, why couldn't there be another? Lu Gaojian could not confirm it either. He only knew that the ninth heaven Celestial King was extremely strong, and when all 9 scrolls were united, the battle prowess was boundlessly frightening. However, he did not know whether it could give a fourth heaven Celestial King the strength to fight a seventh heaven Celestial King. All in all, we have to find this Li Long, the Azure Ghost Celestial King declared grimly. Previously, he has committed another crime. If we do not get rid of this boy, what will be left of our dignity? Yes. The other Celestial Kings all nodded. With ninth heaven Celestial Kings standing guard, Ling Han still managed to do as he liked, killing as he liked. Then all of them would really be disgraced. Additionally, we have to investigate this Li Long further. I suspect that this identity of his may be false, the Azure Ghost Celestial King continued.